Gideon Crane didn't ride out to the Marlowe Ranch himself. That was the first thing people got wrong about him. Men like Crane never did their own dirty work. They sent others, paid well, and kept their hands clean enough to shake at church on Sunday. But on the morning of April 3rd, 1883, he made an exception. He rode out with 6 men at dawn, before the desert had a chance to cool into something bearable, and he went straight to the front porch of Elena Marlowe's ranch house and told her, in a voice so calm it was almost polite, that she had until sundown to load what she could carry and leave the property permanently. Elena didn't move. She stood in the doorway with flour still on her hands from the morning's baking and looked at Crane the way a person looks at something they've been expecting and dreading in equal measure. "That land isn't yours," she said. "It never was." Crane reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He held it out to her at arm's length, not close enough for her to take it, just close enough for her to see the territorial seal pressed into the paper at the bottom. "It is now," he said. Then one of his men stepped forward and kicked the front door clean off its hinges. If you've ever stood in a place you built with your own hands and watched someone take it from you, not with violence, not in a fair fight, but with a piece of paper and a polished seal, then you already understand what Elena Marlowe felt standing in that doorway. And if you've never felt that, count yourself lucky. Before the story ends, a man with nothing left to lose will ride into Cimarron with blood on his shirt and a bounty on his head, and he will make Gideon Crane's entire empire answer for what happened on that porch. This is that story. If you're watching this for the first time, welcome, and do us a favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single part of what's coming. Drop a like on this video and leave a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one goes deep. The canyon had no name on any map Caleb Voss had ever seen, which was partly why he'd chosen it. It was a narrow cut in the rock about 12 miles southeast of Cimarron, the kind of place that swallowed sound and shadow in roughly equal measure. The walls rose maybe 40 feet on either side, close enough together that 2 horses couldn't pass abreast without one of them scraping stone. The floor was loose red gravel and a thin crust of caliche that crumbled underfoot. There was no water. There hadn't been for 11 days. Caleb was lying with his back against the eastern wall, his left leg stretched out in front of him at an angle that wasn't entirely natural. The wound in his side had stopped bleeding sometime in the night, but it had closed badly, the way wounds do when a man can't stop moving long enough to let them close right. He could feel the heat radiating off the rock behind him, even through his shirt. It was barely past 7 in the morning, and already the canyon was an oven. Scout stood 6 feet away, reins dragging, watching him with the patient, slightly reproachful expression that horses develop when they've been pushed past what's reasonable and haven't yet been given an explanation they find satisfying. "I know," Caleb said to him, without looking up. Scout flicked an ear and didn't move. Caleb had been listening for the better part of an hour to the sounds coming from the canyon mouth. 3 sets of hooves, maybe a quarter-mile out. Moving slow, too slow. That was the thing about experienced hunters. They didn't rush. Rushing was for men who hadn't caught anyone before. The 3 men following Caleb Voss had caught a great many people before. He knew their names because he'd made a point of learning them the moment he understood someone had put money on his head. The one out front would be Dutch Mercer, 52 years old, thick through the chest, missing the tip of his left index finger from a knife fight in Abilene that he hadn't entirely won. Dutch had been collecting bounties since before Caleb was born. He was methodical in the way that a man becomes methodical after he's survived enough situations that should have killed him. Not because he was naturally cautious, but because he'd learned the cost of carelessness by watching others pay it. Behind Dutch, on his left, would be a younger man named Cobb. Caleb didn't know Cobb's first name and wasn't sure Cobb used one anymore. He was fast. That was his entire reputation. Just that one word, passed around territorial saloons and sheriff's offices like a coin that had been rubbed smooth. Fast. People said it the way they might say a river was cold, as simple fact, with the implication that you should keep it in mind. The third man Caleb hadn't been able to get much on. Someone back in Springer had called him Priest, which was probably a nickname and definitely not a compliment. He was described as quiet and careful and not particularly interested in whether the person he was collecting had a heartbeat when they arrived. $5,000. That was the number Gideon Crane had put on Caleb's head. And it was the kind of number that brought out a specific quality of hunter. Not desperate men looking for an easy score. Desperate men made noise, took shortcuts, got impatient. $5,000 drew professionals. It drew men who were very good at their work and very calm about the nature of it. Caleb shifted his weight against the rock wall and winced. The wound in his side pulled when he moved, a deep grinding sensation that sat somewhere between pain and pressure and wasn't entirely either one. He'd wrapped it with what was left of his spare shirt, packed tight against the entry point. But wrapping and resting were two different things, and he hadn't had much of the second. He reached down and checked the revolver on his right hip. Full. He had a second revolver tucked under his coat on the left side, also full. The rifle was with Scout, in the scabbard, and the rifle was the problem. To get to it, he'd have to stand up and cross 6 feet of open ground, which was 6 feet more than he wanted to cover if the entrance to this canyon was being watched. He decided the rifle would stay with Scout. The hoofbeats stopped. Caleb counted his own heartbeats. Got to 14 before he heard Dutch Mercer's voice, which carried farther than it had any right to in that still morning air. "Boss, you're in there." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a threat exactly. It was the opening line of a business transaction, spoken by a man who'd conducted this particular transaction enough times to have developed a standard phrasing. Caleb didn't answer right away. He pressed his back harder against the rock and studied the canyon entrance. There was a gap of maybe 20 feet between the walls at the mouth, and morning light was coming through it at a low angle, throwing long shadows east. Anyone entering would be backlit for the first several steps. That was something. "We know you're wounded," Dutch continued. "We've been following your blood trail since Springer. You ride a distinctive horse, and your left boot drags a little when you're favoring that side. We've been reading this since day 3. Caleb glanced at his boot. The heel was worn down on the inner edge. He'd never noticed it dragging. He filed that information away with the particular frustration of a man who realizes he's been leaving a readable trail and didn't know it. "I'm going to tell you something," Dutch called, "and I'd like you to listen to all of it before you make any decisions. The man who put money on you, Crane, we don't know his reasons, and we don't care about them. We're here for the collection. If you come out on your own, you ride back to Cimarron without anyone touching you further. If you make us come in and get you, Cobb's going to be the one who goes first, and he's not particularly interested in being gentle." There was a pause. The silence had a quality to it, alert, compressed, like the moment before weather breaks. "I don't see 3 gunslingers," Caleb said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended from 11 days of dust and too little water. He cleared his throat and said it again, even, flat, without any particular performance behind it. "I see 3 dead men." Another silence. This one had a different texture. "That's a lot of confidence for a man bleeding into his boots," Dutch said. "Maybe," Caleb said. "Come find out." What happened next took about 90 seconds. Later, if anyone had asked Caleb to describe it, he probably couldn't have given them a clean account, because the truth of a gunfight, the real truth, not the kind that gets retold in saloons, is that it's not a sequence of clear decisions. It's a compression of everything you've learned in your life arriving at once, and you either translate it fast enough or you don't. Cobb came through the entrance first, because that's what Cobb did. Fast men are also, as a rule, impatient men, and Dutch's voice had barely finished its last echo when Cobb was already moving. He came through the canyon mouth at a half-run, pistol already clearing leather, eyes adjusting to the shadow interior, looking left and right in the quick scanning pattern of a man who'd done this before. He was looking for Caleb at standing height. That was the assumption. A man propped against a wall would be at eye level, visible, containable. Caleb was on the ground. He fired twice from his position against the eastern wall, both shots angled upward, and Cobb went down in the loose gravel with a sound that wasn't dramatic. None of it was dramatic. Cobb was fast, and then Cobb was lying very still in the red dust, and that was the sum of it. The second shot came from outside, Dutch or Priest, impossible to tell which, and it sparked off the rock 2 feet above Caleb's head and sent chips of stone raining down onto his shoulders. He was already rolling, which hurt more than anything he'd done in the last 11 days. But the alternative was worse. He came up onto his knees behind a natural fold in the canyon wall. Not much cover, but enough to make him a harder angle. Dutch came through the entrance slower than Cobb had, lower, using the wall. Trained. Caleb respected it even as he tracked the man's movement. He didn't fire. He waited. Dutch froze inside the entrance, using Cobb's position as a reference point to triangulate where the shots had come from. He was good. His eyes landed on the fold in the wall where Caleb was sheltered within about 4 seconds. He brought his gun up. Caleb was already 2 feet to the right of where Dutch was looking. The canyon, like he'd said, he knew it better than they did. He'd spent the better part of 3 days in it before they arrived. He knew where every shadow pooled, where the rock changed color, where a man could step without making noise in the gravel. He put Dutch Mercer down with a single shot and then sat very still for 60 seconds, listening for Priest. Nothing came through the entrance. Nothing came from above. He'd checked the rim when he arrived, and it was sheer on both sides, no purchase for climbing. After 2 minutes, he heard hoofbeats. Receding. Moving south. Priest had done the math and arrived at a different answer than his partners. Caleb sat in the red gravel of the canyon floor with his back against the folded rock, his side screaming, his hands not entirely steady, and he let out a long, slow breath that he felt like he'd been holding for 11 days. Scout came over without being called and lowered his head to about knee height and stood there, which was the closest a horse could come to expressing concern. "I know," Caleb said again, quieter this time. He needed to move. Priest would be back, probably with more people, and sitting in this canyon was only going to get harder to defend over time. But his body was running a serious argument against any kind of immediate movement, and for a long moment he let the argument go on without intervening. He thought about how he'd gotten here. Not the last 11 days. He knew those well enough. Every dusty mile, every wrong turn, every moment he'd considered stopping. He meant the longer version, the one that started almost a year ago with a different road and a different kind of trouble. He'd been passing through Cimarron on his way to somewhere else, which was a thing that happened to him often, because he didn't usually have a somewhere specific in mind. He'd been doing work along the territorial routes for a few years, livestock moving, the occasional escort job when someone needed papers delivered between towns without the papers getting lost along the way. Nothing that paid spectacularly, nothing that required him to be anything other than competent and quiet. He'd stopped at Cimarron because Scout had thrown a shoe and the nearest farrier was there. He'd been in town 2 days when he saw Elena Marlowe. She'd come in with a wagon loaded with supplies, driven it herself, no ranch hand alongside her, which even then had struck him as slightly unusual. Women ran ranches in the territory. That wasn't remarkable. But they usually didn't come into Cimarron alone, not in that period, not with the kind of tension that had been building around the land disputes in the valley south of town. He'd watched her go into the general store, come out with what she'd come for, loaded in the wagon with an efficiency that suggested she'd done it many times, and had no patience for it taking longer than necessary. Then he'd watched 3 men he didn't recognize walk out of the saloon across the street and position themselves around her wagon. They hadn't touched her, hadn't said anything loud enough to carry across the street, but the way they arranged themselves, one at the wagon wheel, one near Scout's hitching post where Caleb had left him, one slightly behind the woman, wasn't accidental, and it wasn't friendly. Caleb had crossed the street. He'd asked Elena, politely and directly, whether she was acquainted with these 3 men. She'd looked at him with an expression he hadn't fully understood until later. Something between relief and wariness, like a person who's learned not to trust help because it so often comes with conditions, and said, "No, I am not." The 3 men had looked at Caleb with the practiced assessment of men used to calculating odds. He'd looked back at them with the expression of a man who'd already completed those calculations on their behalf. They'd left. He hadn't expected to see Elena Marlowe again after that afternoon, but she'd waited until the men were gone and then said, without particular preamble, "Those men work for Gideon Crane. He's been sending people like that around for the better part of 3 months. My ranch is in the Southern Valley. He wants it." "Why tell me?" Caleb had asked. "Because you look like a man who doesn't belong to anyone," she said, "and I'm running out of those." That conversation, standing next to a wagon in the main street of Cimarron, with Scout watching from the hitching post, had been the beginning of all of it. He'd learned, slowly and in pieces, the shape of what Crane had built in that valley. It wasn't crude intimidation, though there was some of that. It was something more constructed. Crane had been acquiring land in the territory for 4 years, not always through outright purchase, often through legal mechanisms that looked correct if you didn't look closely. Disputed claims resolved in Crane's favor. Surveys that came back with measurements that happened to place boundary lines differently than the original deeds. A county clerk who'd been in Crane's pocket long enough to have developed a professional comfort with adjusted paperwork. Elena's land was different. Her father had built the ranch 22 years earlier, and the original deed was clear, witnessed, and registered in Santa Fe. Crane's people had produced a competing claim, but the competing claim had visible problems, dates that didn't align, a witness signature belonging to a man who died before the document was supposedly signed. Elena had found all of it. She'd spent a year comparing documents, writing letters to the territorial office, keeping every piece of paper she could get her hands on. What she hadn't been able to do was get the evidence to Santa Fe without Crane's people intercepting it. That was where Caleb had come in. He hadn't intended for it to go as far as it had. He'd thought he could move the documents without becoming the story. He was wrong about that. Crane's network in the territory was wider than he'd understood, and the moment word reached Crane that someone was helping Elena move evidence toward the capital, the calculation shifted. The $5,000 bounty had appeared inside of 2 weeks, announced in territorial papers, and posted at every relay station from Raton to Las Cruces. $5,000 was what Gideon Crane thought Caleb's death was worth. It was also, unintentionally, a measure of how seriously Crane had taken the threat he represented. Caleb didn't find that particularly flattering, but he did find it clarifying. He pulled himself to his feet using the canyon wall, which took longer than it should have and cost him a sound he wouldn't have made if there'd been anyone else listening. Scout stepped forward automatically, reading the movement, positioning himself at an angle that allowed Caleb to grip the saddle horn without having to reach. "I need you to find water," Caleb told him. "Not today, but soon." Scout turned his head slightly and regarded him with what appeared to be professional skepticism. Caleb got himself into the saddle in 2 stages, neither of which were graceful. Once he was up, the height gave him a clear view of the canyon entrance and the flat desert beyond it. No movement. Priest was gone, at least for now, and in the particular mathematics of pursuit, gone now always meant coming back later, and with a revised strategy. He turned Scout toward the eastern wall of the canyon, where a narrow path he'd found on day 2 angled up through a fault in the rock and came out on the plateau above. It was steep, and Scout didn't like it, but it would put him on higher ground and moving north, which was the direction he needed. He had a decision to make. The documents were still at Elena's ranch. She'd trusted him to move them, and 3 bounty hunters in 11 days of desert had kept that from happening. If he rode north now, he could reach Cimarron in 2 days. He could rest. He could get the wound looked at by someone who knew what they were doing. He could figure out a different route to Santa Fe. Or he could keep going south, back to the ranch, and get the documents himself. Every reasonable argument pointed north. He was hurt, running low on supplies, and had just killed 2 men that Crane would want accounted for, which meant the bounty on his head was about to get even more serious attention. But Elena had been waiting. She'd been waiting for months before he arrived, and she'd be waiting still, and the longer the documents stayed under her floorboards, the more chances Crane had to find them, to find a way to discredit them, to find some legal mechanism to make them irrelevant. He'd made her a promise on a dirt road outside Cimarron in November. He hadn't made many promises in his life, and the ones he had made, he'd kept, even the ones that had cost him. He turned Scout south. The horse went without argument, which meant Scout either trusted his judgment or had given up arguing with him, and Caleb wasn't entirely sure which one it was. The desert opened up below the canyon in long, flat stretches broken by dry wash channels and stands of mesquite that had never been asked for anyone's opinion before producing exactly the terrain they wanted. The heat had settled into its daily rhythm, the kind that didn't climb dramatically, but simply maintained itself at a consistent and exhausting temperature until sundown. Caleb rode with his hat pulled low and his mind working. Crane's next move would be to consolidate. He'd hear about Dutch and Cobb within a day or 2, Priest would make sure of that. And his response would be to shift from individual bounty hunters to something more coordinated. Crane had enough money to put armed men on every road south of Cimarron if he chose to. He probably wouldn't. It would attract the kind of attention from the territorial authority that he preferred to avoid. But the roads nearest Elena's property would be watched, which meant Caleb would need a route that wasn't a road. He knew one. He'd found it in his first 2 weeks of moving through the territory, a livestock trail that paralleled the main road by about 3 miles to the east, used by ranchers moving cattle to summer pasture and largely invisible from the road because it ran through a series of shallow ravines that folded it out of sight. It added a day to the journey, but that day felt like a reasonable trade against the alternative. The wound was going to be a problem. Not immediately. He'd ridden hurt before, and the body adapted in unpleasant but manageable ways. But the wrapping needed to come off and be replaced properly, and he was going to need water before he could do that. There was a spring 2 miles off the livestock trail that he'd marked mentally on his first pass-through. He'd aimed for that. By midday, he'd covered about 7 miles and had stopped twice. Once to check his back trail, once because the pain had spiked in a way that required him to sit still for a few minutes and breathe through it carefully. He didn't like either stop. The first made him feel cautious in a way that ran close to nervous, and he didn't like being nervous because it clouded things. The second was just undignified. He was finishing the second stop, one hand pressed flat against his side, when he heard hoofbeats. Not from behind. From ahead. Single rider, coming up the ravine from the south. Moving at a walk, which meant they weren't running from anything or rushing toward a known destination. That narrowed the possibilities but didn't settle them. Caleb eased the revolver loose in its holster and waited in the shadow of a mesquite stand, watching the ravine bend 20 yards ahead. The rider who came around it was not what he'd been prepared for. She was on a small gray mare, riding without ceremony, a rifle across her saddle that she handled the way someone handles a familiar tool rather than a dramatic prop. She had dark hair pulled back severely from a face that looked like it had made peace with most of what had happened to it and was reserving judgment on a few remaining items. She was maybe 40 or 35 that had been treated roughly. She was wearing a man's coat over her own clothes, which fit in the shoulders and nowhere else. She pulled the mare up when she saw him and didn't reach for the rifle, which he noted. "You're Caleb Voss," she said. Not a question. "Who's asking?" "Elena Marlowe," she said. "And before you say anything, yes, I know I was supposed to stay at the ranch. I know what you're going to say about that, and I'd ask you to say it faster than you probably planned to, because we don't have time." He looked at her. She looked at him. "You rode north," he said, "looking for me." "I rode north looking for whoever came out of that canyon alive," she said. "I've been watching that canyon entrance since yesterday morning. When only one set of tracks came out going east, and they were scouts, I followed them." "That was reckless," Caleb said. "I know," Elena said. She didn't seem particularly troubled by it. "But Crane's men found the loose board in the kitchen last week. They didn't find the documents. I'd already moved them. But they know I have something. They'll be back with more authority the next time. Maybe a week. Maybe less." Caleb sat with that for a moment. "Where are the documents now?" Elena reached into the interior pocket of the man's coat and produced a folded oilskin packet, the kind used to keep papers dry through weather. She held it out to him. Her hand was steady. "I've been carrying them since the moment they found the board," she said. "I wasn't going to let them sit in one place anymore." He took the packet, felt the thickness of it through the oilskin, more paper than he'd expected, tucked it inside his own coat. "You moved your own evidence," he said. "I have been protecting that evidence for 3 years," she said, and there was a flatness in her voice that wasn't anger and wasn't patience, but something between the two that people arrive at after they've been angry long enough. 3 years. I'm not going to stop protecting it now because you're supposed to be the one carrying it." He didn't say anything for a moment. "You need water," she said, looking at his side. "And that wrapping needs to come off and be done right. There's a spring east of here I can take you to. After that, we talk about how we move." "I know about the spring," he said. "Then let's go." She turned the gray mare east without waiting for his agreement, which was either presumptuous or simply efficient, and he followed her because she was right about the water and the wrapping, and because the documents were now in his coat, and because he'd turned Scout south for a reason, and here that reason was already riding. The spring was where he remembered it, tucked into a shaded cut in the rock that kept it cooler than the surrounding desert. Elena dismounted and watered both horses while Caleb got down with less grace than he would have liked, and sat on a flat rock and unwrapped the makeshift bandage. It was worse than he'd thought, which was more or less what he'd expected. "There's a man in Cimarron," Elena said, watching him examine the wound with the clinical detachment of someone trying not to wince. "Warren Hale. He's old, and he drinks too much, and he was a bounty hunter for 30 years, which means he's dealt with gunshot wounds as both an inflicting party and a receiving party. He'll know what he's looking at. Warren Hale quit the territory 2 years ago, Caleb said. I heard he was in Arizona. He came back, Elena said. He came back because he got old enough to start feeling bad about some of the things he did for money, and Cimarron is where he happened to be when that feeling got heavy enough to stop moving. She paused. He's been helping me, in small ways. Watching roads, passing word. He's not what he was, but he knows things. Caleb looked at the wound, looked north toward Cimarron, then south toward where Elena's ranch sat in the valley. 3 miles of open ground to reach the livestock trail. Then a day north to Cimarron. Then the question of how to move 2 people and a packet of documents to Santa Fe through Crane's increasingly motivated attention. He thought about what Dutch Mercer had said about reading his trail since day 3. He thought about Priest, riding south to report. He thought about Crane, sitting in his ranch house or his Cimarron office or wherever he sat, doing the same kind of mathematics that Caleb did, and arriving at conclusions that would be put into motion before Caleb could fully account for them. $5,000 had bought 3 hunters. What would Crane spend now? Whatever it cost, he would spend it. That was the thing Caleb understood about men like Crane. Not that they were ruthless, plenty of people were ruthless, but that they were patient in their ruthlessness. They didn't get angry. They got methodical. The empire Crane had built in the territory had been built methodically, one corrupt transaction at a time, and he would defend it the same way. The only way to beat methodical was to be unpredictable. Caleb pulled his spare shirt from his saddlebag and cut it into strips with his belt knife. Elena took the strips from him without asking and began to wrap the wound properly, and she did it with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done medical work before, not formally, but out of necessity. "How long have you been running your ranch alone, what?" he asked, partly to distract from what she was doing to his side. 7 years, she said. "Since your father died?" "Since my husband died," she said, not correcting him exactly, just establishing fact. "My father died before that. My husband ran the ranch with me for 4 years, and then died of a fever that took 3 weeks to finish what it started. After that, it was just me. And the ranch kept going. The ranch kept going because I worked it," she said, with a directness that didn't invite sentiment. "It's a good piece of land. Better water access than most in the valley, which is why Crane wants it. Water is power out here. You control the water, you control what grows, which controls who eats, which controls everything else." She tied off the last strip of cloth and sat back on her heels. "That's what this has always been about. Not the land itself, the water." Caleb hadn't known that. He'd understood the land dispute in terms of property rights, legal mechanisms, the corrupt paperwork. He hadn't understood the resource underneath it. "The documents," he said. What exactly do they prove?" 3 things, Elena said, standing up and brushing dust from her knees. "That the deed Crane produced for the Southern Valley parcels, including my land, is a forgery. The witness signatures don't match the registered records in Santa Fe, and one signatory died 18 months before the document claims he signed it. Second, that the county surveyor who adjusted the boundary lines received payment from Crane's land company in the month before he submitted his revised measurements. I have a copy of that transaction. And third," she paused. "Third, that Crane's main ranch draws from the same underground water channel as half the valley, and he's been drawing from it at a volume that violates territorial water law, specifically to reduce flow to downstream properties, mine included." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant amount of evidence," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why he's been trying to get it for 3 years." He stood up carefully, and the wrapping held better than the old one. Still hurt, but held. "Cimarron first," he said. "Then we plan the route to Santa Fe." "What about Priest?" Elena asked. She'd been paying attention to everything he'd said and everything he hadn't. "He'll be back," Caleb said. "But he'll come with a plan, and plans take time to form. We have a day, maybe 2. That's enough to get north and figure out the next piece." "You seem very certain about that," she said. "I'm not," he said honestly. "But certain men make faster decisions, and faster decisions are better out here." She considered him with that expression again, the one balanced between relief and wariness that kept its judgment in reserve. "All right," she said, "north." They rode, the 2 of them, through the desert afternoon with the documents pressed against Caleb's side, and Scout making his opinion of the whole situation known through occasional pointed silences. The territory stretched out around them in every direction, enormous and indifferent, the kind of landscape that had never particularly cared whether people survived it or didn't. But it had given them this: a livestock trail that ran east of the road, a spring that held water in dry country, a canyon that had swallowed 2 experienced hunters and returned only 1. It had given them enough, for now. They reached Cimarron 2 hours before dark on the second day. The livestock trail had done what it was supposed to do, kept them off the main road and away from the watched approaches, but it had added miles that Caleb's side didn't particularly thank him for, and by the time the rooftops of town appeared on the horizon, he was riding with one hand on the saddle horn in a way that was less about balance and more about having something to grip when the pain spiked unexpectedly. He hadn't said anything about it. Elena hadn't asked. They'd developed over those 2 days a kind of wordless understanding about which things needed to be said aloud and which could simply be acknowledged and set aside. She told him more about Warren Hale on the first evening when they'd stopped at a dry wash to rest the horses and eat what little she'd brought in her saddlebag. Not much food, not much water left. She'd planned for a day's riding, and they'd stretched it into 2. Hale had come back to Cimarron 14 months ago, she said, and had taken a room above the farrier's shop that nobody else wanted because it smelled permanently of burning hoof and iron. He was 61 years old and looked older. He'd spent 30 years riding territorial circuits collecting people who didn't want to be collected, and the work had not been kind to him in ways that didn't show in the obvious places. His hands were steady, his eyes were clear, but there was something worn through in him, she said, the way a rope goes thin in one spot from rubbing against a fixed point long enough until the thread count drops below what can be trusted. He feels responsible, Elena had said, poking at their small fire, for some of what happened in this valley. Not Crane specifically. He wasn't involved with Crane, but he collected men for money when he was younger and didn't ask many questions about the men who paid him or the reasons they wanted someone found. He told me he started asking questions too late. What made him start? Caleb had asked. He collected a man outside of Taos, she said, brought him in alive. Found out 2 weeks later the man's wife had been burned out of her house while her husband was in custody, and their 2 daughters had been sent to live with strangers in Colorado. The man who'd put up the bounty wanted him out of the way to clear a land claim. The man never actually committed any crime. She paused. Hale said he went back to Taos and tried to find the family. Couldn't. After that he stopped taking work. Caleb had thought about that for a while. He understood the arithmetic of it, the way a person can do something for long enough that it feels like occupation rather than choice. And then one day the specific weight of one particular thing lands differently than all the others. He didn't say any of that, but he understood it. Now, riding into Cimarron with the dust of 2 days on them and the oilskin packet inside his coat growing heavier than its actual weight, he was thinking about what came next. Not just the route to Santa Fe, though that needed working out. I was thinking about what Crane's response to the canyon would look like, and how much time they had before that response arrived in a form that was difficult to navigate. The farrier's shop was on the south end of the main street, which was useful. It meant they could come in from the livestock trail side without crossing the full length of town. Elena led him there directly, with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going and had thought through which streets to use. The door at the side of the building had an exterior stair going up, and Elena went up those stairs without hesitating and knocked twice, then once, then twice again. A pause. Then the sound of something being moved across a floor. Then the door opened. Warren Hale was exactly as Caleb might have assembled him from Elena's description, and simultaneously nothing like what he'd imagined. He was tall in the way that men who were once broader become tall when age strips the weight from them. The frame was there, but the fill had gone. He had a beard that had reached a kind of informal truce with trimming, mostly gray, and eyes that were the color of creek water in a dry year. He was wearing a shirt that had been washed recently but not ironed, and his boots were already on, which meant he slept ready or he'd heard them coming. He looked at Caleb with the comprehensive assessment of someone who'd spent a career evaluating physical condition quickly. "How long ago?" he asked, meaning the wound. 11 days, Caleb said. Hale's mouth compressed slightly. "Come in." The room was small and smelled as advertised, iron and hoof and the underlying char of hot metal. But it was clean in the way that people clean when order is a thing they can control even when most things aren't. There was a cot, a table with 2 chairs, A shelf with bottles on it that weren't all whiskey, but weren't all not whiskey either, and a window that looked out over the back alley and could be closed with a board that leaned against the wall beside it. Caleb noted the board. He noted the placement of the chair nearest the door. He noted that Hale's gun belt was on a peg within arm's reach of where he'd been sitting, not locked away, not casual. Old habits and old men don't retire. They just get quieter. Hale had Caleb sit on the table edge and unwrap the bandaging without ceremony or preamble. Elena stood near the window, not watching exactly, looking out at the back alley with the expression of someone keeping watch. She'd been doing that reflexively for days, probably for months. The constant background monitoring that comes from living alone in a place that's been repeatedly reminded it isn't safe. "This has been infected," Hale said, examining the wound with 2 fingers and a directness that made Caleb's jaw tighten. "Not badly, not yet. But you've been moving too much and not cleaning it right." "I've been a little occupied," Caleb said. "I know. Elena told me about the canyon, Dutch Mercer." He said the name with the neutral recognition of someone who'd known the man professionally. He was good at what he did. "He was," Caleb agreed. "You're better." "I knew the ground," Caleb said. "That's most of it." Hale gave him a look that suggested he found this modesty either unconvincing or irrelevant, and went to his shelf and began taking things down. He had what he needed, which was more than most people in a farrier's loft above a territorial town would be expected to have. He cleaned the wound and repacked it and rewrapped it while Caleb sat still and mostly didn't make sounds. And when it was done, Hale said, "You need 3 days of not riding." "I need one," Caleb said. Hale looked at him, looked at Elena, back at Caleb. "1," he said. It was an agreement. It was a man filing a complaint with a body that had already made its decision. "I need to know what's been moving through town," Caleb said. "Riders, strangers, anything from the south." Hale sat down in the chair nearest the door and laced his fingers together and thought for a moment with the deliberateness of a man who's learned that what you say first tends to set the shape of everything after. 3 days ago," he said, "a man came through who wasn't a local. Asked questions at the saloon about the Marlowe property. Not directly. Asked about water rights in the Southern Valley, which direction certain roads ran, who owned what parcels down there. The bartender told me about it because the man paid for information in a way that made the bartender feel like he'd been caught accepting it." "Description," Caleb said. "Quiet, 40s, wore his coat collar up even in the heat." Hale paused. "I'm told he left heading south the same afternoon." "Priest." The description matched what little Caleb had been able to piece together. "He came back through yesterday morning," Hale continued, "heading north this time, fast." North meant Rayton, which meant the telegraph office, which meant Crane's main operation. The timing lined up. Priest had found the canyon, done his accounting, and gone to report. He would have arrived at wherever Crane was by now. The response, whatever shape it took, was already being organized. "How many men does Crane have that can be moved quickly?" Elena asked from the window. She hadn't turned around. "In the territory?" Hale said. "A dozen, maybe 15 who've done that kind of work for him. He also has connections in Rayton and Las Vegas, men he can hire on short notice if the permanent arrangement isn't enough." "He'll want to stop us before we reach Santa Fe," Caleb said. "Not just slow us down, stop us entirely. The documents get to the territorial office and his land claims fall apart publicly, and that's not something he can manage or redirect. He'll know that." "He's known that for 3 years," Elena said. "That's why he's been doing everything except come for them directly." Caleb looked at her. "What do you mean directly?" She turned from the window then. In the lamplight of Hale's small room, she looked tired in the specific way that people look tired when they've been fighting something for so long that the fighting has become the texture of ordinary life. He could have burned the ranch, could have sent men to tear up the floorboards a long time ago and search the place properly. He didn't. "Why not?" Caleb asked. "Because he needs the land to come to him clean," she said. "If he burns the ranch or is seen as having done violence to it, the story changes. He can't walk into a territorial court with a forged deed and explain why the previous owner's house burned down. He needs me to leave voluntarily, or to have a claim that looks settled, or to have the documents simply disappear. Real violence leaves marks. He's been careful about the kind of marks he makes." Caleb sat with that. It was a more sophisticated understanding of Crane's strategy than he'd had before, and it shifted some of his calculations. If Crane was constrained by the need to keep his actions deniable, then the response to the canyon would need to look like something other than what it was. Official channels, maybe. A warrant. Some legal instrument that gave his men cover to stop two riders on the road to Santa Fe. "Does Crane have a judge in his pocket?" he asked Hale. Hale made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "He has two territorial magistrates who've ruled in his favor 4 times in the last 3 years. Whether that means they're in his pocket or just persuadable, the outcome's the same." He reached for one of the bottles on his shelf. It was, in fact, whiskey, and poured 2 fingers into a tin cup and held it toward Caleb. "For the pain, don't argue." Caleb took it, didn't argue. The whiskey was bad. He drank it anyway. "There's a third route to Santa Fe," Hale said, setting the bottle back. "Not the main road, not the Eastern Pass. There's a courier route used by the land office. It runs through the Mora Valley and comes out on the south road well past the last of Crane's usual territory. It's longer, harder terrain, but it doesn't cross any point where a warrant could be served easily." "You know this route?" Caleb asked. "I ran courier work through it for 1.5 years, Hale said, "before the bounty work. I was 23. He looked at his hands for a moment. "I know where the water is and where the ground goes soft after rain, and I know 2 places where a man could watch both approach directions for 1/2 mile in each direction. If you're moving something valuable through territory that might be watched, it's the route I'd take." Caleb looked at him. "You're offering to come." Hale didn't answer immediately. He looked at the cup, at his hands, at the window where Elena stood. "I was a bounty hunter for 30 years, he said finally. "I was very good at it. I made enough money to not need to work anymore. And I spent the last 2 years sitting above a farrier shop in a town that smells like burned metal, thinking about a man outside Taos and his 2 daughters in Colorado." He picked up the cup and looked at the small amount left in it. "I know the route. I can ride it. I'm not what I was, but I'm not nothing either." 3 people are harder to move quietly than 2, Caleb said. 3 people are also harder to stop quietly than 2, Hale said. That was true enough, and the route through Mora was something Caleb hadn't known about, which meant Crane probably didn't have it accounted for in his plan. Unknown route, unexpected approach. Those were advantages that Caleb was disinclined to give up simply because they came with a 61-year-old former bounty hunter attached. "We leave at first light," Caleb said. "1 night. That's what we have." He spent that night in Hale's second chair, upright, because lying down made the wound pull in a way that woke him, and he needed the hours more for thinking than for sleeping. Elena took the cot at Hale's insistence and was asleep within minutes, which meant she was either exhausted past the point of anxiety or she'd made some decision about the situation that let her rest. Either way, he didn't disturb it. He thought about Crane. He'd been thinking about Crane in pieces since November, assembling a portrait from what Elena told him and what he observed and what he could reason out from the man's actions. Crane was 60 or close to it. He'd arrived in the territory from somewhere in Texas with capital behind him and a working knowledge of how territorial land systems could be navigated by someone patient enough to learn their particular mechanics. He'd built his cattle operation honestly in the first years, or at least not dishonestly enough to attract notice. And then, when the scale of his ambitions outpaced what honest accumulation could provide, he'd shifted methods. What Caleb understood about Crane, and what he'd come to believe was the key to him, was that the man didn't think of what he was doing as crime. He thought of it as leverage. Every forged document, every bought magistrate, every surveyor who revised a measurement for a quiet fee, to Crane, those were tools. The same way a hammer is a tool. You didn't feel guilty about using a hammer. Men who thought that way were, in Caleb's experience, more dangerous than men who knew they were doing wrong and did it anyway. Men who knew they were wrong could be surprised by their own guilt. Men who'd decided they were simply leveraging what was available couldn't be reached that way at all. The only thing that reached them was consequence. In the hour before dawn, Hale got up quietly, made coffee on a small iron stove, and brought Caleb a cup without asking if he wanted it. They sat for a while in the lamplight without talking, which was comfortable in the way that silence between men who've both seen a particular kind of life can be comfortable without requiring explanation. "You knew Dutch Mercer well?" Caleb asked. "Well enough," Hale said. "We ran some of the same circuits in the 70s. Different enough in our methods that we weren't natural partners, but there was respect." He looked at his coffee. He was patient, maybe the most patient hunter I ever saw. He'd wait 3 days in a single position if he thought his target was going to move through it. He was patient until he wasn't, Caleb said. Yes, that's what patience does eventually. It runs out or it gets confident. Same failure, different feeling on the way in. Hale drank his coffee. He was 62 days from retirement. Did you know that? He told me last year. Said he was going to buy a small place in Colorado, raise chickens. Caleb didn't say anything. I'm not telling you that so you feel bad about it, Hale said. I'm telling you because it's true, and true things deserve to be said. I know. He made a choice, Hale said. He chose the $5,000 over the chickens. That's his account, not yours. I know that too, Caleb said. And he did know it. It didn't make it light, but it made it clear, and clear was enough. Elena was awake before the coffee was finished. She didn't seem surprised that they'd been up and talking. She accepted a cup, drank half of it, and said, What are we bringing? What do we leave? They talked through it practically. Hale had a pack animal, a sturdy brown mule named with no particular creativity. Mule, that could carry supplies and the things they couldn't afford to leave behind. They couldn't move fast with a mule, but the Mora route wasn't a fast route anyway. It was a careful route, which was a different thing. They'd take enough food for 5 days and hope the route gave them 3. They'd take water for 2 days and know the route's water sources for the rest. They'd take ammunition that they hoped not to use and the documents that the entire exercise depended on. Elena had the documents in the oilskin packet inside her coat now. Caleb had suggested it, and she hadn't argued, and he hadn't suggested it because he didn't trust her to protect them. He'd suggested it because if they were separated at any point, the documents needed to be with the person most determined to see them reach Santa Fe, and that person was Elena Marlowe, had always been Elena Marlowe, was going to remain Elena Marlowe regardless of what the next several days looked like. He told her that, and she'd looked at him with an expression that was hard to read and didn't try to. They left Cimarron before the town was properly awake, going out through the back of the farrier's building and north for a quarter mile before cutting east on a path that Hale led them to without apparent effort, moving through the early morning dark with the comfort of a man revisiting a route from long memory. The path was barely a path, 2 wheel ruts from a wagon that had gone through decades earlier, and a slightly lower graze line on the scrub where livestock had moved. But Hale followed it without hesitation. Scout moved quietly in the dark. The mule moved with the stoic indifference of an animal that has decided its opinions about most situations are neither needed nor particularly listened to. Elena's gray mare kept pace in the middle, and the 3 of them put Cimarron behind them with the particular efficiency of people who understand that the time spent leaving is time that should not be extended. The Mora Valley route began in earnest an hour after dawn, when the path they were following dropped into a long, shallow canyon that ran roughly east-southeast through terrain that looked inhospitable but moved through more easily than the surface suggested. Hale was right that he knew it. He navigated decisions about where the path split and which way the ground firmed up and which dry creek beds could be crossed safely with the unconsulted certainty of physical memory. Caleb rode and watched the ridgelines. The thing about watching ridgelines was that you could do it for days and see nothing, and the nothing didn't mean anything was confirmed safe. It meant you hadn't been surprised yet, which was a different and smaller category of reassurance. He watched anyway, because the alternative was not watching, and he'd survived long enough to understand that survival was mostly a collection of habits that looked like caution and felt like paranoia until the one time they mattered. Around mid-morning, Hale called a stop at a spring tucked into a rock outcrop that looked exactly like every other rock outcrop on the canyon floor, and that Caleb would not have identified as a water source in 100 tries. They watered the animals and refilled their own containers, and Elena sat on a rock and took the oilskin packet out of her coat and looked at it for a moment. I counted them last night, she said, before I slept. The documents. 43 individual pages. Some of them are original, some are copies I made. The copies are in my handwriting, and I know that's a weakness. A lawyer for Crane could argue the originals are elsewhere, and the copies prove nothing. The originals are in there too, Caleb said. Yes, but the strongest piece is a letter, she said, written by Crane's land agent to the county surveyor. It's specific about the payment amount and what was expected in return. That letter exists because the land agent had his own reasons for putting it in writing. He was protecting himself in case Crane tried to deny the arrangement later. She turned the packet over in her hands. The land agent's name is Thomas Fry. He's been in Las Vegas, New Mexico for the last 8 months. I have an address. Caleb looked at her. You found his address. I've been doing this for 3 years, she said. Yes, I found his address. There was a beat, and then Hale made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh Caleb had heard from him. What? Elena asked. Nothing, Hale said. I've just spent 30 years working for men who underestimated women. It's a pattern that produces predictable results. Crane underestimated me, Elena said. Not bitter, just accurate. He still does, Caleb said. He put the bounty on me, not on you. He's been trying to recover a document package from a ranch he thought was outmatched. He doesn't know you've been walking around with the evidence in your coat for the past week. Good, she said. She put the packet back inside her coat. Let him keep not knowing. They were moving again within 15 minutes, and the day settled into the particular rhythm of hard travel. The steady mechanical work of covering distance, the monitoring of the terrain, the management of discomfort without letting it become distraction. Caleb's side had moved from acute pain to a grinding, persistent ache that he could, with some effort, categorize as background noise. It would spike if he moved wrong. He tried not to move wrong. He and Hale rode near each other for much of the afternoon, and between stretches of silence they talked in the short, practical way of people covering ground together, about the terrain, about water, about what to expect in the Mora Valley's lower section. But at some point the talk shifted, the way it does sometimes when two people have been quiet enough together to lower some of the usual costs of speaking honestly. You don't ask why I'm doing this, Caleb said. Hale glanced at him. No. Most people would. Most people ask questions to fill silence, Hale said. I've had enough silence not to need that. He paused. I watched you for about 4 hours yesterday, in that room. The way you sit, the way you look at exits, the way you asked about Crane's habits before you asked about the road. You're a man who's been between things for a while, not attached to a place, not particularly attached to a plan. You're helping her because something about the situation caught you, and now you're in it. That's roughly accurate, Caleb said. I'm not asking for the specifics, Hale said. The specifics are yours. Caleb was quiet for a moment. The canyon walls had opened up here, the terrain widening into a flat stretch before the next narrowing, and the afternoon light was long and amber and made everything look slightly more resolved than it was. I was in Abilene for 3 years, he said, working livestock routes. I was good at it, and I didn't dislike it, but I didn't particularly like it either. After that, I moved south because there was work in the territory and I hadn't been here before. I got to Cimarron in November because Scout needed a shoe. He paused. I saw her in the street, 3 men around her wagon, and I thought, that's a situation where someone with enough wrong assumptions is going to do something that goes badly for someone who doesn't deserve it. So you crossed the street, Hale said. I crossed the street. And then she told you about Crane. And then she told me about Crane, Caleb said. And I thought I could move the documents without becoming part of the story. I was wrong about that. Hale was quiet for a moment. She does that, he said. She explains things clearly, and you see the shape of what's wrong, and you think, someone ought to do something about that. And then you realize you're already standing in it, and you've already said you'll help, and by the time you understand what helping actually costs, you've made a kind of commitment that it's hard to walk back without feeling like something important about you has changed for the worse. Caleb looked at him. She did that to you too. 14 months ago, Hale said. She came to my door and asked if I knew any back roads through the valley that weren't on the territorial maps. Just information, just a conversation. He looked straight ahead at the trail. Now here I am riding to Santa Fe with a mule. Despite everything, Caleb found something close to a smile in that. They camped that night in a cut at the base of a long ridge that Hale selected for its defensive geometry. 2 approach directions, both visible from the fire position, a back exit through a gap in the rocks if things went wrong. Nobody said any of this aloud. It was simply the kind of campsite that men with particular histories chose without explanation. Elena made the fire small and the coffee strong, and they ate the dried provisions Hale had packed without complaining about them, because complaining required energy, and the day had spent most of what was available. In the firelight, Elena spread out a hand-drawn map that she'd apparently been carrying separately from the documents, a sketch of the southern valley, done in a careful, precise hand that showed property lines and watercourses and landmarks. She talked through it for Hale's benefit, because she'd already shown Caleb parts of it. The water channel that crossed her property and fed several adjacent ranches. The measurement adjustments the corrupted surveyor had made, and what the original lines were. The 4 parcels that Crane had absorbed in the valley over 3 years. Hale listened and asked 2 questions, both specific, both about legal mechanisms rather than personalities. He'd done more legal research than Caleb had expected from a former bounty hunter, and said so. "I had time," Hale said, "and access to a man in Cimarron who used to practice law in Missouri before he came west for his health. We talked through the land law a few times. I wanted to understand what Elena was dealing with." He looked at the map. "The surveyor is the weak link. Not Crane. Crane's insulated himself. But the surveyor took money and changed measurements, and that's criminal fraud with documentary evidence. If the territorial attorney takes it seriously, the surveyor talks, and the surveyor's testimony will unlock everything else." "And if the territorial attorney doesn't take it seriously," Elena said. "Then we go to the Federal Land Office," Hale said, "which has jurisdiction over territorial surveys and the authority to override local corruption if the evidence is strong enough." He paused. "I looked into that too." Elena was quiet for a moment, looking at her map, at the precise lines she'd drawn over what looked like months of careful attention. Then she folded it and put it away and looked into the fire with the expression of someone who's been holding a weight for so long that setting it down would feel strange. "I just want to keep the ranch," she said. It came out quietly, without performance. "I know it sounds small compared to everything, but my father built it. My husband worked it. I've worked it for 7 years alone. It's good land and it produces, and I know every foot of it. I don't want justice in the abstract. I want to go home." Nobody said anything for a moment. "You'll go home," Caleb said. She looked at him. "You sound certain." "I'm working on it," he said. She held his gaze for a moment and then nodded once and went back to looking at the fire. The second day on the Mora route moved faster than the first. The terrain in the lower valley section opened up into broader flats that allowed better pace, and Hale's knowledge of the route's water sources meant no time was lost searching. They covered nearly 20 miles by midday, which was more than Caleb had calculated, and the extra distance felt like something concrete added to their advantage over whatever Crane was organizing behind them. He couldn't know what that organization looked like, which bothered him more than any specific threat would have. Known threats could be planned for. Unknown planning in progress was simply a pressure you carried and couldn't entirely put down. They were an hour into the afternoon when Hale brought his horse to a sudden stop and held up a hand. Caleb stopped. Elena stopped. The mule took an additional step and then stopped because everyone else had. Hale was looking northeast, at a ridgeline about a quarter-mile out. Caleb followed his gaze and saw it, a single horse, barely visible at the ridge crest, standing still. The rider was there but obscured by distance and angle. "How long?" Caleb said quietly. "Don't know," Hale said. "Just caught it." The horse on the ridge hadn't moved. If it was a scout, the scout already knew they were there. Moving or staying put would give the same information at this point. The question was what came next. "One rider isn't an assault," Caleb said. "No," Hale agreed. "It's intelligence." Elena looked at the ridge and then at Caleb. "Priest?" she said. "Probably." The man had a habit of watching, of not engaging until the calculation was in his favor. He was gathering information about their position, their number, their route. That information would be relayed, and then the larger response, whatever shape it had taken, would know where to meet them. "How far to Santa Fe from here?" Caleb asked Hale. 2 days, if the lower route holds. "How far to the point where the route comes out onto the main south road?" "This evening," Hale said. 3 hours, maybe?" Caleb looked at the ridge. The lone horse had disappeared, moved back behind the crest line, no longer visible. Gone the way. Priest went in the canyon, quietly, with purpose, carrying something back to someone. "We need to separate," Caleb said. Both Hale and Elena looked at him. "Not permanently," he said. "The route merges with the south road this evening. If Crane's people are being coordinated by that rider, they'll set up somewhere between here and Santa Fe on the main road. 2 of us need to get to Santa Fe. One of us needs to make sure that whoever's set up on the road is dealing with a different problem. He paused. Elena and Warren take the route to Santa Fe. I go back to Cimarron. Why Cimarron? Hale asked. Because if I'm visible in Cimarron, Crane's people in the territory have a choice: stay on the road watching for the documents or deal with the man who killed two of their colleagues in a canyon. Some of them will split to deal with me. Fewer men on the road between you and Santa Fe. That's not a plan, Elena said. That's you making yourself a target. I've been a target since November, he said. Cimarron's where I know the ground. I'd rather be a target there than on a road where I don't know what's been set up. She looked at him for a long moment. The same measuring expression she'd had in the street, on the road, at the spring. That reserve she kept, that judgment still pending. You'll get yourself killed, she said. Probably not, he said. I know the town and I'm still better at this than most people they can send. Probably not is not reassuring. No, he agreed. It isn't. Hale was watching them both with the careful attention of a man who understood the situation clearly and was deciding whether his opinion had been requested. He's right about the split, Hale said finally to Elena. I don't like it either, but two targets are harder to manage than one, and if I get you to Santa Fe with those documents, the rest of it becomes smaller. Elena looked at Hale, back at Caleb, at the ridgeline where the horse had been. If you die in Cimarron, she said, I will be extremely angry about it. Noted, Caleb said. She held his gaze for another moment, then looked away. Fine, she said. Fine. We split at the road junction. They covered the 3 hours to the junction in less time than Hale had calculated. The terrain was cooperative and they pushed the pace. At the point where the narrow route met the edge of the south road, they stopped and Caleb checked his weapons. Both revolvers, the rifle from Scout's scabbard, the remaining ammunition in his coat pockets. Hale gave him 2 extra boxes of cartridges from the mule's pack without comment. Caleb took them. Elena was looking at the road south, the direction she'd be going. She had the documents. She had Hale. She had 2 days of travel to Santa Fe and an address in Las Vegas for a land agent named Thomas Fry, who'd made the mistake of putting a criminal arrangement in writing because he didn't trust the man paying him. She turned to Caleb. The spring near the canyon, she said. After this is finished. You know the one. I know it, he said. Then we'll meet there. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the same steady, withheld expression that had been there since the beginning, since a street in Cimarron and 3 men around a wagon and a question about whether she knew them. He turned Scout north. He didn't look back, not because he didn't want to, but because looking back was a habit he'd worked for years to stop, and the work wasn't finished, and some days it held better than others. He rode toward Cimarron with the afternoon light against his back and the ridgeline where Priest had been empty against the sky, and the town 2 days ahead of him, and a set of calculations already running about what would be waiting when he arrived. He rode into Cimarron on the afternoon of the second day, and the town felt different the moment he crossed the northern approach. Not obviously different. Nothing that a casual visitor would notice. The main street looked the same buildings on the same dirt, the same hitching posts in front of the same establishments, the same geography of a territorial town that had grown along a road rather than around any particular plan. But Caleb had spent enough time in Cimarron to know its ordinary rhythms, and the rhythm was off. 2 men outside the saloon who weren't drinking, just standing. A horse at the far end of the street tied in a way that suggested its rider intended to leave quickly. The livery stable's side door, which was usually open in the afternoon, closed. He didn't slow Scout's pace. Slowing drew attention. He rode at the same steady walk he'd maintained through town a dozen times before, looking at things the way a man looks when he's not looking. Peripheral, casual, cataloging without appearing to catalog. 6 men. That was his count by the time he reached the middle of the street. Positioned at the saloon, at the hardware store across from it, at the corner of the feed merchant's building, and one on the second floor of the hotel at the north end. Just a shape behind the window glass, but shapes behind windows didn't appear there accidentally. The bounty on his head had brought professionals to that canyon. What Crane had sent to Cimarron was something different, hired men rather than hunters, the kind that came in numbers because numbers were their strategy. They weren't especially subtle, but they didn't need to be. 6 guns against 1 was its own kind of argument. Caleb rode to the farrier's shop and dismounted and led Scout inside as if he'd come for an ordinary reason. The farrier, a heavy-set man named Ortiz, who had been working the same anvil in Cimarron for 20 years, looked up from a wheel rim he was straightening and read the situation in about 4 seconds. "Don't ask," Caleb said. "How long have those men been in town?" "Since yesterday morning," Ortiz said, setting down his hammer. 6 of them. They told the sheriff they were passing through. The sheriff believed them, or acted like he did, which is not the same thing. "Where's the sheriff now?" "At home," Ortiz said. "He told his deputy he had a headache. He's had a headache for about 20 hours. He looked at Caleb with the expression of a man communicating information through implication. "He's not a brave man. He's not a coward either. He's a man who calculated what 6 armed strangers meant and decided his headache was going to last until the mathematics changed." Caleb understood that. He didn't blame the sheriff. Bravery without strategic position was just an expensive way to die. "Is there anyone in this town who would cause a problem if those 6 men were removed from it?" he asked. Ortiz thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. "Not among people who've lived here more than a year," he said finally. "Crane's not popular in Cimarron. He's powerful, which people respect because they have to, but he's not liked. He took the Garfield property last spring, the one on the valley edge. Ben Garfield had been here 18 years. People remember things like that. Caleb tied Scout to the interior post and spent a few minutes doing nothing in particular, checking a stirrup that didn't need checking, adjusting a saddlebag that was already adjusted, while his mind worked through the geometry of what he'd observed. 6 men. The hotel window sniper was the problem. He needed to think about first, because elevated position changed everything. The 2 at the saloon could be addressed sequentially if he controlled the approach angle. The man at the feed merchant's corner had a good sight line on the middle of the street but limited cover behind him. The others he'd need to locate more precisely before any of this made sense as a plan rather than a count. What he had going for him was the same thing that had kept him alive in the canyon. He knew the ground, and they didn't. He'd been in Cimarron enough times over the past months to understand its geography in the specific way that matters. Not just where things were, but how they connected. Where an alley dead-ended, where the space between buildings was wide enough for a horse, and where it wasn't. Where the ground sloped slightly, and which way, and what that meant for a man trying to move quickly and quietly. He also had something else, which he hadn't expected to have. The door at the back of the farrier's shop opened, and a woman came in carrying a covered dish. She was perhaps 60, broad through the shoulders, wearing a plain dress and an expression that suggested she'd made a decision and wasn't interested in discussing it. Behind her came a man Caleb recognized, Ben Garfield, the rancher Ortiz had mentioned, somewhere in his 50s, with the particular weathered quality of someone who'd worked outdoors for decades and hadn't been protected from any of it. Behind Garfield came 2 other men Caleb didn't know by name, though he'd seen them in town before. One was younger, maybe 25, with a serious face. The other was older than everyone present and walked with a cane, which didn't appear to slow him down. "We saw you ride in," Garfield said, without greeting, without preamble. He looked at Caleb the way people look when they've been thinking about something for a while and have arrived at the place on the other side of thinking where decision lives. "We know who those men are, and we know why they're here." "How do you know why they're here?" Caleb asked. "Because one of them got talking last night," the younger man said. He had a slight accent, not territory-born. "At the saloon, talking to another one of them, not to any of us. But walls in this town are thin." He paused. He said Crane wanted the town clear of interference before he moved on the Marlowe property. He said anyone who'd been helping her would be dealt with along with the target. The target was Caleb. "They're not just here for me," Caleb said. "No," Garfield said. "They're here to make a point. That Crane can do what he wants in this valley, and nobody in Cimarron does anything about it." He looked at his hands, then back at Caleb. "My family built a house on that property 18 years ago. Crane had a piece of paper that said otherwise, and 2 men with guns that said I should leave before I finished reading the paper." Something moved in his face that wasn't anger exactly, but was related to it, the residue of something that had been burning for months. "I left. My wife cried for 3 weeks. My youngest daughter still asks when we're going home." He stopped. "I'm done leaving." Caleb looked at all of them. The woman with the covered dish, Garfield, the serious young man, the old man with the cane. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you this is safe," Caleb said. "It isn't. 6 armed men is a serious situation, and I have a wound in my side that's going to make me slower than I want to be. If any of you are here because it seemed like the right thing to do, and you haven't thought past that, go home now. I won't think less of you." Nobody moved. "What I need," Caleb said, "is not people with guns. What I need is people who know this town and will do specific things at specific times without me being there to tell them each step." He looked at Garfield. "Can you do that?" "Tell me what," Garfield said. He told them. It took 20 minutes. He drew the main street layout in the dust of the farrier's floor with a stick, buildings, alleys, angles. He assigned each person a position and a task that had nothing to do with shooting. The woman with the covered dish, her name was Mrs. Reyes, and she had lived in Cimarron for 31 years, and nobody paid particular attention to her moving through town, would deliver her dish to the hotel kitchen at the back entrance, which would take her past the hotel's interior stair. She wouldn't go upstairs. She would simply confirm whether the man at the window was still there and on which side of the hall his room was. Garfield would go to the hardware store on the pretense of purchasing nails, which was plausible because Garfield bought nails regularly and the hardware store owner would recognize him. He would note exactly where the man inside the store was positioned and whether he was watching the front or the side window. The serious young man would take his wagon to the far end of the street and park it across the alley beside the feed merchant's building, not blocking it, just making it narrower. He would do this as if unloading something, taking his time. The old man with the cane would sit on the bench outside the barber shop, which he apparently did most afternoons anyway, and would count the time from when Caleb emerged from the farrier's shop. What Caleb would be doing during all of this was moving, not through the main street, through the backside of town, the alley network that ran parallel to the main street on the western edge, where buildings backed up against each other and the gaps between them were too narrow for comfort, but passable for a man who didn't mind narrow. He'd move north from the farrier's shop, come around behind the hardware store, and from there work his way through the geometry he'd drawn in the dust. The hotel sniper was first, not because he was the most immediate threat, but because a position in a second-floor window was the one advantage that reordered everything else. Get that off the board first, and the remaining 5 men were managing a street fight, which was a different and more manageable kind of problem. "The man at the window," Caleb said to Mrs. Reyes when she came back. "Which room?" "Second floor, east side," she said. "Third door from the stairs." The door was open. "He's got a chair pulled to the window and he's sitting sideways to it, watching the street. Chair by the window, not at it?" "Sideways," she confirmed, "like he doesn't want to be visible from below." That was competent positioning, not amateur. Caleb adjusted his thinking accordingly. Mrs. Reyes handed him the covered dish, which she'd apparently emptied into the hotel kitchen in the course of delivering it, because it was lighter now than it had looked. He wasn't sure what she'd done with the food and didn't ask. He went out the back of the farrier's shop. The alley on the western edge of town was everything he'd remembered. Narrow, shadowed, even in afternoon light, smelling of coal smoke and old wood, and the accumulated residue of a working town's backside. He moved north along it with his right hand clear of his coat and his breathing controlled and his attention divided between where he was going and the sounds from the main street 20 feet to his right. He could hear normal town noise, horses, voices, a door somewhere. Nothing that suggested alarm or accelerating purpose. The 6 men were waiting, not moving. That was what waiting men did. They maintained their positions and watched the street and communicated through eye contact and the occasional deliberate stillness that was its own kind of signal. They were waiting for him to come back to Main Street. He went around behind the hotel. The hotel's back was a service entrance and a small yard with a woodpile and a pump. The owner, a man named Briggs, who'd said nothing in favor of Crane in Caleb's recollection and nothing against him either, had his kitchen window open. Caleb could smell coffee and something frying. I went past the kitchen window without stopping, up the back of the building along the exterior wall, and found the window that corresponded to the east side, third door from the stairs. It was closed, which he'd expected. A man sitting sideways to watch the street would keep the window shut to reduce his profile. Caleb stood below it for a moment, listening. Nothing from inside. The man was quiet. He tried the back exterior stair, which existed because the hotel had been built in 2 stages. The second floor added later, with a stair that accessed the storage rooms on the east end and connected to the hall. It was an architectural afterthought, which meant it hadn't been accounted for in the man's positioning. The stair's third step from the top had a soft spot that Caleb's foot found before his weight went onto it. He shifted left, put his weight on the frame edge, and cleared it. The door at the top was unlatched. The hall was dim, the smell of old wood and pipe smoke and linseed oil from the floors. He moved to the third door and stood beside it and listened. He could hear faintly the creak of the man in the chair shifting his weight. Alive, positioned, watching. Caleb opened the door. The man at the window was 30, maybe 32, and he was fast. Faster than Caleb had given him credit for, because he'd had the rifle in his lap, which meant it was already in hand rather than on the floor, and he came out of the chair and brought it around in the same motion. He was good. He was also in an enclosed room with a rifle that needed space to swing, and Caleb was already inside that space. What happened in the next 4 seconds was not clean or easy or in any way like the stories told about such things. It was close and hard, and cost Caleb a reopened wound and the man in the chair a future in this or any other profession. And when it was finished, Caleb was leaning against the doorframe with one hand pressed against his side and his heart running considerably faster than he'd have liked. He gave himself 60 seconds. Not because 60 seconds was enough, because it was what he had. Then he went back down the exterior stair. From the hotel window position, the man at the feed merchant's corner was visible, 50 feet south, at the exact angle Caleb had calculated. More importantly, the wagon that the serious young man had parked across the alley had done what it was supposed to do, narrowed the feed merchant man's retreat option to the street where he'd be exposed. Caleb came around the south side of the hotel into the main street, and the situation assembled itself around him in the way that these situations do, fast, without ceremony, requiring responses rather than consideration. The 2 men at the saloon saw him first. He'd positioned himself in the middle of the street rather than at the edge, which was counterintuitive, and that was the point. Men watching from positions expect their targets to seek cover, to hug the sides, to work the geometry of protection. Standing in the open middle of a street is not what a tactical mind predicts, and the 2 seconds of recalibration it produced were 2 seconds he used. He called out in a voice that carried without particularly trying. "I'm going to offer this once. Crane sent you here to deal with a problem, and the problem is me. I've already dealt with your man in the hotel window. If you want to know how that conversation went, look at the second floor. If you'd rather not look, take your horses and ride north and tell whoever's paying you that the contract in Cimarron is closed." Nobody rode north. He hadn't expected they would. Men who'd come this far and this organized didn't quit on words. He'd made the offer because making it was important. Not for them, for the people in Cimarron watching from their doors and windows and the gaps between buildings, the ones who would remember what happened here and whose account of it would matter later. The man at the feed merchant's corner moved first, angling toward the street. He was trying to get a lateral angle, which was smart. Caleb moved toward him rather than away, closing the distance before the angle could develop. And the shot the man got off went past him near enough that he felt it as a disturbance in the air rather than a sound. His own shot didn't miss. The 2 from the saloon came together, which was the mistake. 2 men moving together are one decision, and one decision produces predictable patterns. Caleb moved right on a diagonal, which split the angle, and what happened next was 3 shots in under 4 seconds, none of them wasted, 2 of them settling what needed to be settled. The man from the hardware store had come out onto the sidewalk during the exchange, and he stopped when he saw what the street looked like. And he stood there for a moment doing the arithmetic that survivors of violent situations do. What just happened? How fast it happened? What that means about the person who caused it? He made a calculation and set his gun on the sidewalk and put his hands up, which was reasonable and acknowledged. That left one. Caleb had counted 6 and dealt with 5, and the 6th had been somewhere he couldn't see from the main street. He stopped in the middle of the street with his revolver up and scanned. The shot came from behind the water trough at the north end, and it was close. Close enough that it clipped his left arm above the elbow, a shallow tear that bled immediately and dramatically, and was not, he determined in the relevant fraction of a second, serious. He went down to a knee anyway, not from the hit, but because kneeling made him a smaller target and identified the position and returned fire twice. After the second shot, there was no more shooting. The street was very quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that a town produces when it's been holding its breath and doesn't quite believe the sound has stopped. Caleb stayed on one knee in the middle of Main Street and did not move, because moving quickly when you weren't certain the situation was finished was how people got added to the wrong count. He watched the water trough, watched the saloon door, watched the hotel window, empty the way he'd left it, and the feed merchant's corner and the hardware store sidewalk where the surviving man still stood with his hands up, apparently unwilling to change that arrangement until someone told him it was appropriate to do so. Then Garfield was crossing the street toward him, and Mrs. Reyes was coming from somewhere on the left, and Ortiz had appeared from the direction of the farrier's shop, and the town of Cimarron was filling the street with the particular energy of people who'd been watching something terrible and were now moving into the space where it had happened, not yet sure what to do with the space but unwilling to leave it empty. Caleb got to his feet. The wound in his side had reopened. He could feel it, that specific warm spreading sensation that meant the wrapping had failed. His arm was bleeding into his sleeve. He'd had worse. He wasn't sure if that was a reassuring thought or simply a depressing one. Garfield reached him and put a hand on his shoulder in a way that was both steadying and unannounced, and Caleb accepted the steadying without comment because his legs weren't entirely reliable at that moment, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "There's a doctor on the East Road," Garfield said. "Not in town, a mile out. He came here 2 years ago from Ohio. He's real. He has equipment." "After," Caleb said. "After what?" "After I know the town is clear." Garfield looked around the street, at the men who weren't getting up, at the man at the hardware store with his hands still raised, at the old man with the cane who'd pushed himself to his feet from the barber's bench and was walking toward them with the purposeful unhurry of someone who'd survived enough to know when the worst part was finished. "It looks clear," Garfield said. "It looks clear," Caleb agreed. "Give it 5 more minutes." He spent those 5 minutes standing in the middle of the street, which was not comfortable in any physical sense, but which served a purpose. Visible, present, not retreating. The people of Cimarron who came out of their buildings and their doorways needed to see the situation concluded rather than simply stopped. Those were different things. The man from the hardware store was dealt with practically. His weapons collected, his horse brought around, and the clear message communicated that the road north was open to him, and the road south would become progressively less hospitable the longer he delayed. He rode north within 10 minutes. Whatever he told Crane would be told, and Crane would receive it and respond. That was going to happen regardless. What mattered was that the response would come against a changed situation. A Cimarron that had seen what 6 armed strangers brought into a town looked like when the town didn't simply absorb it. The sheriff came out of his house an hour later, his headache apparently resolved. He looked at the situation on the street, looked at Caleb, looked at the people of Cimarron who were still standing in the street talking in the animated way of people processing a shared experience. He said, with the careful phrasing of a man thinking about how things would be written down later, "I understand there was an incident." "Several," Caleb said. "I'll need to write a report," the sheriff said. "Write what happened," Caleb said. "All of it, including who sent those men and why they were here." The sheriff looked at him for a moment. "That's a specific request." "It's a specific situation," Caleb said. Something shifted in the sheriff's expression. Not bravery exactly, because bravery after the fact was easy, but something close to the decision to be honest in a situation where honesty had costs. "I know who sent them," he said quietly. "I've known for a year what Crane's been doing in this valley. I haven't written it down because I wasn't sure writing it down would do anything except make me the next problem he had to solve." "Write it down now," Caleb said. "Elena Marlowe is on her way to Santa Fe with documentation that will end Crane's operation in this territory. When she gets there, every account of what he's done in this county becomes relevant, yours included." The sheriff was quiet. "I'm not asking you to be brave about it," Caleb said. "I'm asking you to be accurate." The sheriff nodded, slowly. He went back into his office, and Caleb heard distinctly the sound of a desk drawer being opened. Mrs. Reyes had taken charge of Caleb's arm in the way that some people take charge of injured things, without asking permission or offering alternatives. She'd produced cloth and something that stung from somewhere in the vicinity of her apron and was addressing the wound with professional efficiency. "The doctor on the East Road," Caleb said. "When I'm finished," she said, in a tone that did not invite negotiation. He let her finish. Garfield sat on the water trough nearby and talked while Mrs. Reyes worked, not about what had just happened, but about the valley. He talked about the spring before Crane's people had arrived, what the valley had been like. 11 ranches, a cooperative arrangement around the water channel, the kind of loose community that forms when people are dependent on shared resources and recognize it. He talked about how it had changed. One family gone, then another, then himself. The ones who remained were the ones Crane hadn't gotten to yet, or hadn't needed to. If those documents reach Santa Fe, Garfield said, if the claims fall apart, does the land come back? I don't know the law well enough to answer that exactly, Caleb said. But Elena has a man helping her, Warren Hale, who looked into the Federal Land Office's authority over territorial survey disputes. If the surveys are invalidated, the original deeds apply. The original deeds put your land in your name. Garfield absorbed this without visible emotion. The way people absorb things they've wanted for a long time and aren't sure yet if they're allowed to want. Your family in town? Caleb asked. Rented a house on the East Road, Garfield said. My wife takes in sewing. My daughters help her. He paused. My youngest is 8. She doesn't ask about home anymore. She stopped asking a few months ago. He looked at the street. I don't know if that's better or worse. Caleb didn't have an answer for that. He wasn't sure there was one. Mrs. Reyes tied off the wrapping on his arm with the decisive finality of someone who considered the job done and the matter closed. And then she looked at his side, where the original wound had soaked through his shirt in the way that wounds do when they've been pushed past their agreed-upon boundaries. You need the doctor, she said. I know. You need him today, not tomorrow. I know that too. She looked at him for a moment with the specific expression of women who have dealt with men who know they need things and delay getting them anyway. Ben, she said, without turning her head. I'll take him, Garfield said, already standing. The doctor on the East Road was named Calloway, and he was from Ohio, and he had equipment, all of which was accurate, and he was also young enough that looking at the accumulated damage Caleb presented produced a brief expression of something between professional concern and personal alarm that he smoothed over quickly. How long since the original wound? He asked, cleaning it with something that had no particular interest in being gentle. 13 days. Calloway worked without speaking for a while. Caleb sat on the examining table, which was a converted kitchen table with a sheet over it, and looked at the wall and practiced the particular stillness of someone who's decided that whatever's being done to them is necessary, and complaining about it is a waste of energy that could be used for other things. You're not going to be able to use that arm fully for at least a week, Calloway said about the graze. The muscles along the edge of the wound are going to be tight and unreliable. You'll have range of motion, but not strength. All right. The side, Calloway stopped for a moment. The side needed to be dealt with 4 days ago. You've got some tissue that's not responding the way I'd want it to. I can clean it properly now and pack it right, but you need to stay off a horse for 2 days minimum. 1, Caleb said. Calloway looked at him. I'm telling you medically what you need. And I'm telling you practically what I have, Caleb said. 1 day. I'll take the 2nd day slow. Calloway made the sound of a man formally registering his disagreement while knowing it's not going to change anything. He worked for another 20 minutes, thorough and precise. And when he was done, the wrapping was tight and correct, and Caleb felt, relative to the last several days, something approaching functional. He spent the night at Calloway's, not because he wanted to, but because by the time the doctor was done, the light was gone. And riding in the dark on his current reserves was the kind of decision that he could calculate clearly led to bad outcomes. He slept in the chair by the window, which Calloway initially protested, and then abandoned when it became clear the chair was where Caleb was going to be. He thought about Elena and Hale on the Mora route. They had 2 days of travel ahead of them when they'd separated, and a day had passed. They'd be somewhere in the lower valley section now, closer to the South Road Junction, closer to Santa Fe. Unless something had gone wrong, which was the clause he attached to every mental calculation involving people he couldn't see and couldn't reach and couldn't do anything about. He thought about Priest, who was still out there. The man had a pattern: observe, report, reposition. But patterns in people with professional experience could break under sufficient pressure, or could intensify. Priest knew what had happened in the canyon. He knew what the canyon had cost Crane. He didn't know what Caleb had just done in Cimarron's Main Street, not yet, But the man from the hardware store riding north would tell him, or tell someone who would tell him within a day. The question was what Priest did with that information. If he was operating on Crane's instructions alone, he'd wait for new direction. If he had initiative, and some men in that kind of work did, he might move independently. Caleb's best assessment was that Priest would go south. Not toward Cimarron, toward the route to Santa Fe. He didn't know the Mora Valley route, but he knew where the main road was. And if he knew Elena and Hale had split from Caleb, he might know that the split's purpose was to get two people to Santa Fe without drawing the attention that a three-person party would have drawn. He was smart enough to have survived the canyon. He was probably smart enough to work out that logic. It was a calculation Caleb couldn't act on from a chair in a doctor's house on the east road out of Cimarron. He couldn't send word. He couldn't ride. What he could do was sit with the calculation and the discomfort of not being able to do anything about it, and use that discomfort the way he used pain, as a thing to be noted, acknowledged, and set aside rather than dwelt in. He looked out the window at the dark, and the dark looked back with its usual indifference. Garfield came by in the morning with food and coffee and the information that the sheriff had spent the previous evening writing and had sent a rider to Santa Fe at first light with a sealed report addressed to the territorial attorney's office. Caleb didn't know if that would matter. He thought it might, if the documents arrived and the case was being built, and the sheriff's report provided a piece of corroborating context. He thought it was the kind of thing that couldn't hurt. He left Callaway's at mid-morning on his second horse day, which was both medically inadvisable and unavoidable. He rode south and east, not directly toward the main road, but toward the junction where the Mora route came out, the place where, if his calculation about Priest was right, the threat would be positioned. Not ahead of Elena and Hale, necessarily. Between them and Santa Fe. He rode with his right arm available and his left arm limited and his side wrapped in the tight, correct way that Callaway had managed. And Scout moved under him with the patient efficiency of a horse who'd made his peace with the fact that his rider was going to keep doing exactly this kind of thing. The desert around him was quiet in the late morning heat. Big country, indifferent country, the kind that had been here before any of this and would be here after, unmoved by the specific and urgent problems of the people moving across it. He rode south. The main road to Santa Fe was a day ahead of him. The junction where the Mora route met it was slightly closer. Elena and Hale were somewhere between that junction and the capital, carrying 43 pages of evidence that 3 years of Elena Marlowe's life and work had produced, wearing down toward the place where all of it would either matter or it wouldn't. He pushed Scout a little past what was reasonable, and Scout went, because he was that kind of horse, and the terrain opened up ahead of them under the hard, clear sky of a New Mexico afternoon, and Caleb rode into it without looking back. He found them 12 miles north of the main road junction, and the finding was not the reunion he'd calculated. Hale's mule was standing loose on the trail with its reins dragging, which was the first wrong thing. The second wrong thing was the gray mare tied to a scrub oak 30 feet off the path with a knot that looked hurried. The third wrong thing was the silence. The specific quality of silence that a stretch of open country produces when the people in it are holding very still and not making noise on purpose. Caleb pulled Scout up and sat without moving for a full minute, reading the terrain. Then he heard Elena's voice from behind a low rock formation to the east of the trail. Not calling out, not loud, just enough to carry to where she'd calculated him to be if he was approaching from the north. "There's one man behind the mesquite stand at the base of the ridge," she said. "He's been there for about 20 minutes. He has a rifle." Caleb looked at the mesquite stand. 40 yards south of the rock formation, maybe 60 from the trail. Whoever was in it had positioned before Elena and Hale arrived, which meant he'd known the route or known approximately where it came out. Not many people knew the Mora route. The list of who that made it was short. "Hale," Caleb said. "Here." Hale's voice came from a different position than Elena's, further east, which meant he'd separated from her deliberately, giving whoever was in the mesquite 2 targets to track instead of 1. Old professional habit, done without needing to think about it. "How long have you been stopped?" 25 minutes, Hale said. "He was in position before we cleared the last ravine. We spotted him before he saw us. Or before he showed us he saw us." Priest. Had to be. The man had done what Caleb had assessed he might. Moved south along the main road, calculated the junction where an alternate route would emerge, and set up ahead of the travelers rather than behind them. He hadn't gone to Cimarron. He hadn't waited for Crane's coordination. He'd made an independent decision and executed it, which confirmed Caleb's read that Priest was the most dangerous of the three men who'd been sent to that canyon, and the one who'd survived for exactly that reason. "The documents?" Caleb said. "I have them," Elena said. "Can you move east from your position without breaking the ridge line?" A pause. "Yes. 40 feet, maybe." "Do that. Stay low." He heard the faint sound of her moving across the gravel, slow and careful, which meant she was doing it right. He was thinking about the geometry. Priest had a rifle, which meant he controlled range. The mesquite stand was reasonable cover at 40 yards, but not perfect. The scrub growth in that part of the territory was sparse enough that a rifle position inside it was concealed but not fortified. The problem was angle. To approach the stand from the north, Caleb would be visible for most of the distance. The ridge to the east was higher ground, but the approach to it from where he was would be exposed for the first 20 yards. He needed Priest to be thinking about something other than the northern approach. "Warren," he said. "I know," Hale said. He'd apparently been working through the same geometry. "Give me 4 minutes." Caleb waited. He counted the minutes the way he counted his heartbeats, steady, without rushing the count. At 3.5 minutes, he heard Hale moving, and more importantly, he heard the small, deliberate sound of a man making himself audible just enough to redirect attention. A boot shifting on gravel, a dry branch taking weight. Priest heard it too. Caleb saw the mesquite stand shift slightly, the way vegetation moves when a body inside it adjusts position. The rifle barrel changed angle. East. Caleb came off scout in one movement, ground-tied him with a dropped rein, and moved north to south through the open ground at a low run that covered 20 yards before his side registered its full objection to the activity. He cleared the last 10 yards at reduced speed, which he'd known was going to happen, and came into the mesquite stand from the northwest at an angle Priest hadn't been covering. What happened in the next 30 seconds was ugly and close and ended with Priest on the ground with his rifle several feet away, and Caleb kneeling on the gravel with both hands pressed against his side, and the strong suspicion that Calloway's careful wrapping had failed entirely. Priest looked up at him from the ground. His right arm was at an angle it didn't prefer, and there was blood on his temple from the initial contact, but his eyes were clear and tracking. He wasn't finished, but he was finished for the immediate moment, and he seemed to understand the distinction. "The documents are already past your position," Caleb said, breathing through the pain in his side. "You'd have stopped us on this trail, but you didn't account for the man who came from the other direction." Priest said nothing. He looked at Caleb with the appraising expression of a professional encountering another professional and revising his assessment. "Who are you?" Priest asked. His voice was quiet, the way Caleb had been told it was. Not soft, just economical. "Caleb Voss." "I know your name," Priest said. "I mean, who are you that you're doing this? You're not a lawman, you're not her family, you didn't have to be in this at all." It was a genuine question, which surprised Caleb slightly. Most men in Priest's position at this moment weren't asking genuine questions. They were calculating. "A man was kicking in a door," Caleb said. "I didn't like it." Priest was quiet for a moment. "Crane pays well," he said. "I know." "He's going to keep coming. If the woman gets to Santa Fe, if the documents do what she thinks they'll do, he'll adapt. Men like that adapt." "Some of them," Caleb said. "Some of them don't. Either way, she gets to present what she's carrying. After that, it's in other hands." Hale arrived from the east, moving carefully and breathing harder than he'd have liked. He looked at the scene in the mesquite stand with the assessment of someone who'd seen similar arrangements many times. He looked at Caleb's side. "You're bleeding again," he said. "I know. Calloway is going to be deeply unhappy." "Calloway is a day behind us," Caleb said. He looked at Priest. "Your horse. Where is it?" Priest looked at him for a moment, then tilted his head south. "Quarter mile, behind the second ridge." "Warren's going to take your rifle and your revolver," Caleb said. "Your horse stays where it is for now. You're not going anywhere until we're gone, and then you go back to whoever you report to and you tell them it's finished." "Is it finished?" Priest asked. "This part of it," Caleb said. He meant it specifically. This physical part, the pursuit through territory, the men sent to intercept and delay and remove. That part was finished because there was nothing left to send against them that could arrive before Elena reached Santa Fe. Crane could do many things from his ranch or his Cimarron office, but he could not put armed men between two riders and a territorial capital in the remaining hours that remained. Hale collected the weapons with the professional thoroughness of a man who'd done it before and walked Caleb out of the mesquite stand with a hand on his arm that was both guidance and support, and neither of them commented on it. Elena was waiting at the rock formation. She looked at the blood on Caleb's shirt and then at his face, and whatever she was going to say first, she changed to something else. "Can you ride?" she asked. "Yes," he said. It was true, technically. Whether he could ride well was a different question. "Then we ride," she said. "We're 6 hours from Santa Fe." They put Caleb's condition in the category of things that would be addressed after, which was the category it had been in for the better part of 2 weeks. And they rode south to the main road junction and then southwest on the road toward the capital. The afternoon was long, and the road was open, and nothing came at them from any direction, because the machinery that Crane had built to intercept them had been, piece by piece, dismantled. Some pieces by force, some by decision, some by the simple fact of running out of time. They reached Santa Fe as the sun was going down, which gave the city's adobe buildings a particular warm color that Caleb noted, and then mostly stopped noticing because the more pressing matter was not falling off his horse before they arrived at the right building. The Territorial Land Office was closed for the day, which was the first practical obstacle they'd encountered that couldn't be resolved by knowing the terrain. Elena stood outside the closed door for a moment and looked at it with the expression of someone who has come a very long way and finds a closed door a specifically unreasonable obstacle. "There's a man," Hale said. "The territorial attorney. He lives 4 streets north of here. I know the address because I looked it up in Cimarron. I look things up." They went 4 streets north. The territorial attorney was a man named Carver, 50s, in his shirt sleeves when he answered the door, with reading glasses pushed up on his head and the expression of someone who'd gotten comfortable for the evening and was now reconsidering how he'd wanted that evening to go. He looked at the 3 of them on his doorstep. Elena, with the oilskin packet already in her hands, Hale upright and formal, in the way of men who've decided the occasion requires it, Caleb leaning against the doorframe with the carefully maintained posture of a man who was not going to let his body's current state undermine the importance of the moment. Carver looked at the packet in Elena's hands, then at her face, then at Caleb's shirt. "You'd better come in," he said. The next 2 hours were not dramatic in the way of the canyon or the main street of Cimarron. They were the other kind of consequential, the administrative kind, the kind that feels smaller than it is in the moment and larger than it felt in the accounting afterward. Elena laid the 43 pages on Carver's desk and walked him through them in an order she'd clearly planned. The forged deed first, then the surveyor's payment record, then Thomas Fry's letter, then the water rights documentation. She was precise and sequential and utterly without sentiment, and Caleb watched a man who dealt professionally in evidence understand, over the course of 90 minutes, that what he was looking at was the kind of case that didn't come to territorial attorneys very often. Carver asked 2 questions through the entire presentation. Both were about the chain of custody for the originals, where they'd been kept, whether they'd left Elena's possession. Her answers were specific, and he wrote them down. At the end, he took his reading glasses off his head and put them on and read the surveyor's payment record again, slowly. "Thomas Fry," he said, "the land agent. You have an address." "Las Vegas, New Mexico," Elena said. She gave him the street address from memory. Carver wrote it down. He looked at all 3 documents for another long moment. "This is going to take time," he said. "I want you to understand that. A territorial case against a man with Crane's resources and connections does not move quickly. He'll have attorneys. He'll have arguments. The forged deed can be attacked on authentication grounds, even with strong evidence. A competent lawyer will try everything." He looked at Elena directly. "This is a strong case, but strong cases still take time." "How much time?" Elena asked. "Months," he said. "Possibly longer. The water rights claim may move faster through the federal land office, depending on their calendar and whether we can get a federal assessor into the valley before Crane moves to adjust his arrangements." "What does he do?" Hale said. Not a question exactly, more a thinking aloud. "When he finds out the documents are here." "He's going to find out very quickly," Carver said. Men with his network usually do. He folded his hands on top of the documents. What he can't do is make them disappear. They're in my possession now, and I'm going to have copies made tonight and the copies filed separately. Whatever he tries from this point, he's trying it against a public record, not a private one. That changes his options considerably. He looked at Caleb. You look like you need a doctor. I've been told that, Caleb said. Carver sent his housekeeper for a physician, who arrived within the hour and attended to Caleb's side with the controlled alarm of a competent professional confronting neglected damage. It was not a pleasant process. Caleb sat through it in Carver's study, while Elena and Hale talked with the attorney in the next room, their voices audible as a low, consistent murmur through the wall. The sound of people working through something that mattered, doing it carefully, not rushing. The physician finished his work and told Caleb he needed a week of rest without providing any opinion on whether that would happen. Through the wall, Elena's voice had settled into a different register, lower, slower. The precision of the presentation was finished, and what remained was the conversation after, where the official matters were set and the human ones surfaced. Caleb couldn't make out the words, but he recognized the tone. He sat in the chair in Carver's study, with his side properly dressed for the first time in weeks, and his left arm wrapped tightly, and the accumulated weight of the last 2 weeks arranged around him in no particular order, and he let himself be still for a while. Gideon Crane, at that moment, did not yet know what had arrived in Santa Fe. He was somewhere in the territory, his ranch, his Cimarron office, some position of assumed command, managing his response to the events of the past week, sending word to the man from the hardware store who'd ridden north with bad news, calculating what the loss of 6 men and the failure of his attempt to hold Cimarron meant for his position. He was a methodical man, and he was doing methodical things. He would find out soon. And when he found out, what he'd do with it would tell Caleb whether his assessment of the man had been right, whether Crane would escalate into something more reckless than he'd been, or whether he'd go quiet and strategic and begin the long legal fight that Carver had described. Either way, the documents were filed. The record existed. The case was open. That was what Elena had been working toward for 3 years, and it was done. He heard her come into the study doorway and looked up. She looked different than she had every other time he'd seen her. Not relaxed, because Elena Marlowe did not appear to own relaxation as a mode, but something adjacent to it. The sustained tension of someone who's been carrying something very heavy and has finally been permitted to set it down, even if only briefly. She looked at the physician's work on his side. Better? Better, he said. She came and sat in the other chair, the one across from him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The murmur of Hale and Carver's continued conversation came through the wall. He said months, Elena said. I know. That means going back to the valley, waiting. She paused. Possibly with Crane still there, still operating, while the case works through. Carver said his options changed, Caleb said. He can't make the record disappear now. Anything he does from this point is in the context of an open investigation. Visible moves are much harder for a man who's built everything on looking legitimate. He'll find ways, Elena said. Quieter ways. Probably, Caleb said. But you'll have help. Warren's in Cimarron, the sheriff's writing things down. Garfield and Mrs. Reyes and the people in that street, they saw something happen that doesn't unhappen. She looked at him. And you? He didn't answer immediately. The spring near the canyon, she said. You said you knew it. I know it, he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and the thing she'd been keeping in reserve, that measured, unfinished judgment that had been present since a street in Cimarron and 3 men around a wagon, shifted slightly. Not dropped, not resolved. Just adjusted, the way a person adjusts their hold on something they've decided they're going to keep carrying. Then we'll meet there, she said, when this is done. Hale appeared in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee that Carver's housekeeper had apparently produced. He handed one to Elena, one to Caleb, and looked at them both with the expression of a man who had observed a great many human situations across 61 years and had learned that some of them needed nothing from him except to be left alone. He went back into the other room. Caleb drank the coffee. It was good coffee, better than anything he'd had since before Springer, before the canyon, before any of it. He noted this with the particular appreciation of someone who's been without small good things long enough to find them remarkable again. Outside Carver's window, Santa Fe was settling into its evening. Lamplight in windows. The sound of a wagon on the street. The ordinary operations of a territorial capital that had been going about its business all week, while somewhere out in the desert, a set of documents was making its way toward exactly this office and exactly this desk. Tomorrow Crane would know. Tonight, the coffee was good, and the physician had done his work, and 43 pages of evidence were in the hands of the territorial attorney, and the room through the wall still held the low, steady sound of Hale's voice going through the details of the valley water rights, with a man who had the authority to act on them. Caleb sat with all of it, and did not try to make it more than it was, or less than it was, which was, he thought, probably the only honest way to sit with anything. Crane found out on a Tuesday. Caleb wasn't there to see it, but he heard about it later from 3 different people who'd been present or near enough to present. And the accounts were consistent in the way that accounts are consistent when something happens that people want to remember accurately. Crane had been at his Cimarron office when a rider arrived from Santa Fe, not one of his own men, a territorial courier, which was worse in the specific way that official things are worse than private ones because you can negotiate with private things, and you can't negotiate with a courier who's already delivered what he came to deliver. The rider brought a formal notice from the territorial attorney's office. It informed Gideon Crane that a case had been opened regarding land title irregularities in the southern valley of Colfax County, that the case involved documentary evidence currently in the custody of the territorial government, and that a federal land assessor had been dispatched to examine the water rights situation along the underground channel serving the valley's eastern ranches. The water rights part hit first, Caleb was told, because that was the part Crane understood most clearly as foundational to everything he'd built. The land claims could be argued. Attorneys could complicate authentication. But the water rights violation was documented with a payment record and a letter in Thomas Fry's handwriting, and Thomas Fry had been found in Las Vegas 7 days after Elena and Hale arrived in Santa Fe. And Thomas Fry, faced with the specific evidence Elena had preserved, and the choice between loyalty to a man who'd never promised him protection and his own freedom, had made the calculation that most men make when those are the actual options. He talked for 4 hours. What he said filled 12 additional pages in Carver's case file. Crane, by all accounts, sat very still for a long time after the courier left. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't make immediate moves. He was, until the end, a methodical man. He went back to his ranch that afternoon and spent 2 days there, and on the 3rd day his attorneys arrived from Raton, and the legal fight that Carver had predicted began its long, grinding operation. It ground for 4 months. Caleb was in Cimarron for the first 6 weeks of it, which was longer than he'd planned and shorter than his body had arguably required. Calloway, the Ohio doctor on the East Road, had seen him within 2 days of his return from Santa Fe and had expressed his professional displeasure with some feeling. The wound had been redressed correctly, and Caleb had been told, with the specific emphasis of a man who was tired of saying things that weren't being acted on, that the next time he reopened it through physical activity, it might not close right, and that a wound that didn't close right in this territory in 1883 had a predictable and unpleasant set of outcomes. He'd stayed still for 3 weeks. It was the longest he'd been still in years, possibly the longest since he was a child, and he'd managed it with imperfect grace. Too much time in the chair by his rented window, watching the street, watching the slow, visible changes that were beginning to work through Cimarron as Crane's position weakened. Those changes were not dramatic. They rarely are. The drama had happened in the street and in the canyon and on the Mora Trail. What followed was quieter and in some ways more significant. The small recalibrations of a community that had been living under a particular pressure and was beginning to understand that the pressure was releasing. The county clerk who'd been in Crane's pocket resigned his position on a Wednesday without announcement. The 2 territorial magistrates who'd ruled in Crane's favor 4 times each declined to take new cases involving Colfax County land disputes, citing a conflict of interest that had apparently only recently occurred to them. The hardware store owner on Main Street, who'd said nothing either way for 3 years, took down a notice from his board that had been posted by Crane's land office and didn't replace it. None of these were headlines. All of them were consequential. Hale was in Cimarron through all of it, staying in his room above the farrier's shop, which still smelled like burning metal, and apparently always would. He and Caleb had dinner together twice a week at the establishment on the east end of Main Street that served a reasonable beef stew, and didn't ask questions about the company. They talked about the case, about Carver's updates, about the federal assessor's preliminary findings on the water channel, which confirmed, with the authority of a federal document, exactly what Elena had been saying for 3 years. They also talked about other things, the way men do when they've been through something together and find that the shared experience has made other conversations easier. Hale had gotten a letter from Colorado. He didn't say who it was from. He read it twice and put it in his coat pocket. And the next time Caleb saw him, he seemed like a man who'd had something slightly rearranged inside him, not badly, just differently than before. Caleb didn't ask. When Hale wanted to say it, he would. He said it 3 weeks later, over the beef stew. "I found the family from Taos," he said. "The man I told you about, his daughters." He looked at his bowl. "The older one is 22 now. She's a school teacher in Denver. The younger one is 17 and apparently very good at mathematics. Their father died in the jail where I delivered him. Fever, 2 years after." He paused. "I wrote to the older daughter, told her what happened, what I did and what I didn't do." He picked up his spoon. "She wrote back." "What did she say?" Caleb asked. "She said she appreciated knowing," Hale said. "She said she'd always wondered. She said—" He stopped for a moment. "She said her father was not a perfect man and she'd spent a lot of years being angry at him for things that had nothing to do with what happened to him, and knowing the actual story helped her sort out which anger was for what." He set the spoon down without using it. "She didn't forgive me exactly. She didn't condemn me either. She just received the information, like an adult." He picked the spoon back up. "She's 22 years old and she handled it better than I would have." Caleb thought about that, about what it cost to write a letter like the one Hale had written, and what it means to receive one like the one that came back, about the particular kind of courage that isn't physical and doesn't get talked about in territorial saloons, the kind that requires a person to look clearly at what they've done and then do something about it that doesn't fix anything but is still worth doing. "You going to write to her again?" Caleb asked. "I think so," Hale said. "Yes." Elena came back to Cimarron in the 5th week while Caleb was still there. She'd stayed in Santa Fe for the first month, working with Carver daily, going through the case file, providing context for documents that needed context. She knew more about the specifics of Crane's operation than anyone alive, and Carver had used that knowledge the way a good attorney uses primary evidence, precisely, completely, without waste. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon on the gray mare, which had apparently made the trip back from Santa Fe without complaint. She went to her ranch first, which Caleb learned afterward from Garfield, who'd seen her ride past. She went alone, which was her right, and she spent 2 hours there before coming into town. He saw her at the hotel, where she'd taken a room because the ranch house needed work before it was properly livable, some damage from Crane's final inspection that she hadn't had time to address before everything accelerated. She was in the small dining room drinking coffee and reading through papers, and she looked up when he came in with the expression that he'd learned, over months, to read accurately, the one that held back judgment until judgment was warranted and had been adjusting its holdings incrementally in one direction for a while. "Your arm," she said, looking at how he was carrying it. "Better," he said. "Mostly." "Your side?" "Calloway is pleased with it, which is the most optimistic thing I can say." She almost smiled. "Sit down." He sat. The coffee came without asking because the woman who ran the hotel dining room had been watching Cimarron for 30 years and understood its social arrangements better than most. "The ranch needs the south fence rebuilt," Elena said. "The well cover is rotted and needs to be replaced before winter. The kitchen has a wall that Crane's men kicked in when they were looking for the documents, and I've been putting boards against it." She said all of this practically, the way she said most things. "It's going to take a winter's worth of work to get it right. Do you have the hands for it?" "Garfield offered to help," she said, "and his oldest daughter, apparently, is good with carpentry. Mrs. Reyes is organizing a kind of, she called it a work party, several families coming out on a weekend." She paused. "I've never asked for that kind of help before." "How does it feel?" he asked. She considered the question with the seriousness she gave most things. "Strange," she said, "like something I should have learned how to do earlier." Caleb thought there was something true in that, about help, about the particular stubbornness that capable people develop when they've been operating alone for long enough that asking feels like a kind of defeat rather than a kind of sense. He recognized it because he had a version of it himself, the kind that made him ride south when north was safer and stay in a canyon when running was possible and come back to Cimarron when anyone looking at the situation from outside would have kept going. "The case," he said. "Carver thinks 3 more months," she said. "Crane's attorneys are doing what Carver predicted, attacking the authentication of the forged deed. But Fry's testimony covers the gap. Fry was present when the document was produced. He named the man who actually wrote it, which is someone currently residing in Raton, who has been found and interviewed." She turned a page in her papers. "The surveyor flipped 2 weeks ago. He'd been holding out, but when the federal assessor's report confirmed the measurement irregularities, his position became untenable, and he apparently decided that cooperation was preferable to the alternative." She looked up. "It's happening, slowly, but it's happening the way Carver said it would." "And Crane himself?" Her expression shifted slightly. "He came to the ranch," she said. 3 weeks ago, before I got back. I heard about it from Garfield." She set her papers down and looked at her coffee cup. "He came alone, knocked on the door. My neighbor, Mrs. Alderman, was there. She'd been checking on the place. And Crane told her to tell me when I returned that he would accept a settlement. That there was a number, he said, that could resolve the situation without further difficulty." Caleb was quiet. "He sent me a letter too," Elena said. "To Santa Fe. Carver intercepted it and gave it very formal language. The word settlement appeared 7 times. She picked up her coffee. "I wrote back 1 line. "What did it say?" "It said my answer was the same as it had been on the morning he rode to my ranch and kicked my door off its hinges." She drank her coffee. "I didn't use those exact words, but that was the meaning." The case concluded in its 4th month, on a Thursday in late autumn, when the territorial court issued its findings. Caleb was at the spring near the canyon when it happened. He'd been there for 2 weeks, letting the place do what the territory's open spaces do for people who've spent too long in rooms. He heard the outcome from Garfield, who wrote out specifically to tell him, which was a gesture Caleb recognized as the kind that people make when they understand a piece of news belongs to more than one person. The court invalidated Crane's deed to the Southern Valley parcels on grounds of documentary fraud. The surveyor's revised measurements were struck from the territorial record and the original boundary lines restored. The water rights violation resulted in a federal order requiring Crane's Ranch to reduce its draw from the underground channel to legal limits, with penalties for the previous 3 years of excess. Crane did not go to jail. That was the part that sat unevenly for Caleb, as he suspected it sat unevenly for others. The attorneys had built the kind of walls around their client that money builds, and what came through those walls was civil judgment rather than criminal consequence. The loss of land, the financial penalties, the collapsed reputation, not a cell, not what Dutch Mercer and Cobb and 5 men on a Cimarron street had been sent to prevent, but the land went back. That was the thing that couldn't be argued around. The Garfield property, the 2 parcels that had gone to other ranchers Crane had displaced, and Elena's ranch, all of it returned to its original title holders by territorial court order. Ben Garfield's youngest daughter, who'd stopped asking about home, would be going home. Caleb sat at the spring for a while after Garfield rode back to town, and he thought about the distance between what justice looks like in principle and what it looks like when it actually arrives. The gap between those 2 things, which is always present and always uncomfortable, and which a person can either accept as the permanent condition of living in a world made by imperfect people or spend their life being angry about. He'd met people who'd chosen the anger. He understood the choice. He'd just never found it particularly useful. What had been useful? Crossing a street, asking a simple question, following through on a promise because he'd made it and not making it would have cost him something he didn't want to lose about himself. That was all it had ever been, underneath everything. Not heroism, not strategy, just the refusal to be the kind of person who sees something wrong and walks past it because walking past is easier. He watered Scout at the spring and let the horse drink his fill, which Scout did with the unhurried satisfaction of an animal that has survived a great deal and sees no reason not to appreciate the simple things that survive along with it. Elena came to the spring on a Saturday, 10 days after the verdict. He'd half expected her earlier and then thought he'd misjudged, and then she rode up on the gray mare in the late afternoon with the particular quality of a person who's been finishing something before arriving, tying things off, making sure the door is closed correctly before leaving. She dismounted and watered the mare and sat on the flat rock by the spring edge, and they were quiet together for a while in the way they'd been quiet together on the Mora Trail and in Hale's room and in Carver's study. A silence that had been built, over months, into something that could hold weight without straining. "Garfield's family moved back yesterday," she said. "I heard." "His daughter, the youngest." She ran to the door and touched it, Elena said. Just put her hand flat against the wood, like she wanted to confirm it was real. She looked at the water. His wife cried. "He didn't, in front of anyone. But Mrs. Reyes told me he sat on the porch alone for an hour after dark." Caleb didn't say anything. Some things were complete without addition. "The ranch is nearly right," Elena said. "The south fence is done. The wall is fixed, properly fixed, not just boards. The well cover is new. I have 2 hands coming on in spring for the cattle work." She paused. "Warren is staying in Cimarron. Did you know that?" "He told me." "He's been talking to the sheriff. He's thinking about whether there's work he could do, not bounty work. Something else. He said he might help with the county records, making sure the land titles are all correctly restored in the official register. He has the patience for it." She looked up from the water. "He's a different man than the one who was sitting above the farrier's shop when I went to him." "He was always that man," Caleb said. "He just needed the situation where it mattered." Elena looked at him. The light was going amber and long, the way it went in this part of the territory in autumn, the kind of light that made everything look like it had been considered before being placed. "Are you going somewhere?" she asked. Not accusatory, just direct, the way she was direct about everything. He thought about it honestly. He'd been thinking about it for weeks. The question of what came next, which for most of his adult life had been answered by simply moving and letting the next thing present itself. That system had worked in its way. It had brought him to Cimarron and to a street where 3 men stood around a wagon, and a woman with flour on her hands said something worth listening to. "I don't have an answer to that," he said. "That's honest." "I know it's honest," she said. "I'm not asking for a plan. I'm asking if you're going somewhere in the near term or staying." He looked at the spring, at Scout and the gray mare, who'd positioned themselves companionably at the water's edge, with the easy tolerance of horses who've shared enough trail to stop being strangers. "I was thinking," he said, "about that south fence, whether it was built to last or built to get through the winter." Elena was quiet for a moment. "It was built to get through the winter," she said. "The posts on the eastern side need to be reset in spring. The ground is soft there and they'll shift." "That's a 2-person job," Caleb said, "setting posts in soft ground. You need someone to hold the level while the other drives." She looked at him for a long moment with that expression, the one that had been adjusting its holdings incrementally for months, and had apparently arrived at its final position. "Spring is 4 months," she said. "I know." "You'd winter in Cimarron?" "Hale makes reasonable coffee," Caleb said, "and Calloway has expressed a professional interest in monitoring my side through the cold months. He seems to feel I'm a project." She almost smiled again, and this time it completed. "There are things the frontier teaches that no other place teaches in quite the same way, and one of them is this: the land doesn't care about your story. It was here before you arrived, and it'll be here after you're gone, and it doesn't assign meaning to anything you do on it. The meaning is yours to make or not make, entirely." What Caleb Voss had learned, over the years before Cimarron and in the months inside it, was that a person fighting only for themselves is always at a disadvantage they don't fully understand. Because when the cost gets high enough, the only argument for continuing is the self, and the self is a thinner foundation than it appears. But a person fighting for something outside themselves, something that exists whether or not they win, a piece of land, a family that went home, a woman who watered her horse at a spring and waited, that person has a reserve the other kind doesn't have. He hadn't known that consciously when he crossed the street in November. He'd just known he didn't like what he saw. The understanding came later, in pieces, the way most real things come. Gideon Crane spent the following years in a diminished version of his former operation, reduced to what he could legitimately hold, which was less than he'd built, and less than he'd intended, and exactly what the law said he was entitled to. He never came to Elena's ranch again. He never sent anyone else. Whether that was wisdom or simply the exhaustion of a man who'd run his particular race and arrived at a finish line he hadn't planned for, Caleb couldn't say. He suspected it was some of both. The sheriff's report became part of the territorial record. It named names and described events with the accuracy that Caleb had asked for, and it sat in the county file where anyone with a reason to look could find it, which was the only kind of accountability that paperwork provides, but also not nothing. Warren Hale spent that winter organizing the county's land records with a thoroughness that the county had never applied to them before. He found 4 additional title irregularities unrelated to Crane, smaller corruptions, older ones, the accumulated residue of years of imprecise record-keeping and occasional bad faith. He corrected them methodically, one by one, without announcement. The people whose titles were clarified received letters informing them of the correction. Most of them didn't understand what had happened or why. The ones who did sent no reply and received none. It was not the kind of work that produced gratitude. Hale did it anyway. The spring came, the way springs come in high desert country. Abruptly, without much transition, the cold deciding one week that it was done, and the warmth deciding it might as well arrive. The ground on the eastern side of Elena's south fence thawed and softened, and the posts on that side listed slightly, as predicted. Caleb reset them on a Tuesday in April, with Elena holding the level and calling the adjustments. Left, hold, right, that's it. And Scout watching from the fence line with what appeared to be mild professional interest, and the valley around them coming back into the particular green it made for its brief weeks of being green, and the water channel running clear at the property's eastern edge, where it had always run before any of this began. The work took most of the morning. The posts went in solid and level and were packed with the correct material and would hold through the next winter and probably several after. It was not remarkable work. It was the kind of work that ranches require constantly. The unglamorous maintenance of things that matter, the daily argument against entropy that doesn't end and isn't meant to end. It was, when Caleb thought about it, the realest thing he'd done in years.